She left without a word after the divorce. Minutes later, she rode away in a Mafia Boss's limo. He didn't even look at her when he signed. Kang Ji-won sat across the divorce table with the posture of a man dismissing a parking ticket. One hand loose on the pen, the other resting on Yoona Seo's knee, beneath the table, where he thought no one could see. He signed his name like it meant nothing, like 7 years meant nothing. Like the woman sitting 3 feet away from him was already furniture in a room he was done with. And Yoona smiled, not the small, nervous smile of a woman who understood the weight of what was happening in that room. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already won. Amara Belrose signed her papers one line after another. No shaking hands, no red eyes. The kind of stillness that makes people uncomfortable because they don't know what to do with a woman who refuses to perform her own pain for an audience. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked straight through you, like you were already gone, you know exactly what that silence felt like. Before this story goes any further, if you're watching this right now, and you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, I want you to hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Amara's story has traveled. And if this one moves you, hit that like button. Because what happens in the next 2 hours? Nobody saw it coming. Not Ji-won, not Yoona, and definitely not the people who thought they already knew how this story ended. The Seoul family court building sat heavy under a gray November sky, the kind of morning that felt borrowed from somewhere colder, somewhere that had given up on warmth entirely. The hallways smelled like floor wax and bureaucratic indifference, fluorescent lights humming above people who came in with one life and left with another. Amara had been here before. Not in this building specifically, but in this feeling. The feeling of sitting very still while the world decided something about you. She was 32 years old. She had straight-pressed hair that morning, pulled back the way her grandmother Celeste always told her looked serious without trying too hard. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream silk blouse, and she had not eaten breakfast because her stomach would not allow it, not from grief, but from the specific tension of someone who has been holding a very large secret for a very long time and is approximately 45 minutes from being able to put it down. Across the conference table, Ji-won had arrived with 2 attorneys, a personal assistant, and Yoona Seo seated just outside the room in the waiting area, which was already a statement. He didn't hide Yoona anymore. He had stopped bothering with that particular performance about 3 months ago, around the time he decided Amara's silence was compliance rather than calculation. That was his first mistake. It wasn't his last. Ji-won was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something harder, not ugly, but worn into angles that made people look away first. He ran the Bike-ryu syndicate with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no by someone who meant it. He controlled neighborhoods. He controlled contracts. He controlled people through the simple mathematics of what they stood to lose. He had never fully understood that Amara was not afraid of losing. The mediator, a small woman in her 50s named Mrs. Cho, walked through the asset agreement with the careful efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. Joint accounts, shared property listed under Ji-won's legal holdings, the apartment in Mapo-gu, the vacation property in Jeju. Amara's attorney, Soo Jin-han, sat beside her and said almost nothing. She had already done her work. Everything that mattered was already filed, already protected, already moved to places. Ji-won's attorneys would not think to look because they were looking at the wrong map entirely. Ji-won's lead attorney, a man named Baek, who wore his suit like a warning, pushed a revised settlement across the table halfway through the session. Given Ms. Belrose's limited independent financial history, he said, not looking at Amara directly, we're prepared to offer a one-time payment of 40 million won and 3 months of transitional housing support. 40 million won. That was approximately 30,000 US dollars. Soo-jin didn't flinch, Amara didn't flinch. They had practiced this, the not flinching, because Soo-jin had warned her that they would lowball in a way designed to feel insulting enough to provoke an emotional response. And an emotional response was exactly what Ji-won's team wanted on record. We'll review, Soo-jin said flatly. Ji-won glanced at Amara then for the first time since sitting down. Just a flicker. He was looking for the crack, the moment where the composure broke, and she became the woman he'd mentally filed her as, dependent, overwhelmed, and quietly grateful for whatever he gave her. She was looking at the document. He looked away first. The revised terms Soo-jin presented were accepted without argument, because they were airtight and because Amara was not asking for anything from Ji-won's holdings. Not a single property, not a single account. The settlement was lean and clean and final, and Ji-won's attorneys approved it quickly because they couldn't find anything to dispute, which should have alarmed them, but didn't because they assumed a woman taking so little must simply have no leverage. They had confused restraint with weakness. Mrs. Cho stamped the final document at 11:47 a. Amara signed her name Amara Belrose, the name she'd kept hyphenated through the marriage, and had already quietly removed the Kang from 6 months prior in the professional registrations that mattered, and set the pen down. Done. She felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly. More like the particular exhale of a person who has been underwater for a very long time and finally broke the surface. And the air hurts a little because your lungs forgot what it felt like. She stood. She straightened her blazer. She thanked Mrs. Cho. She and Soo-jin walked out of the conference room into the hallway, and Soo-jin gripped her elbow once, just once, briefly, the way women grip each other when words would take too long, and then released it. In the elevator down to the lobby, Amara checked her phone. 3 messages from Elias Park, her investigator. She read them without expression. The car was in position. She typed back, "On my way out." Ji-won caught up with her in the lobby, which she had expected. He would not be able to let it end cleanly. That was not the kind of man he was. He needed the last word, the way some men needed oxygen, not because it sustained them, but because they were terrified of what happened in its absence. Yuna was with him, which Amara had also expected. There was something almost theatrical about the way they moved together, Ji-won with that particular swagger of a man who needs you to see that he's moved on, Yuna with her hand hooked loosely in his arm. Wearing a cream wool coat that Amara recognized from a shopping receipt she had seen on their shared account 4 months ago. Ji-won had bought Yuna that coat with money from an account Amara had managed. She noted it and kept walking. Amara, she stopped. Not because she wanted to, because there were people in the lobby, and making a scene was not something she planned to do today. She turned. Ji-won's face had settled into the particular expression he wore when he was performing generosity, brows slightly soft, mouth almost kind, the practiced look of a man who wanted witnesses. "I hope you're going to be okay," he said. "I mean that. Life outside my world, it's harder than you realize. You've been protected for a long time." Yuna stood just behind his shoulder, and Amara saw her press her lips together to hold the smile in. Protected. That was the word he chose. Amara thought about the hours she had spent in private meetings with bankers and attorneys and property managers. She thought about the 12 different LLCs she had quietly structured over 4 years. She thought about the conversation she'd had 2 weeks ago with a venture capital contact in Singapore who wanted to co-invest in her next acquisition. She thought about the $35 million that had grown from $13 million through 7 years of decisions Ji-won never knew were being made in the apartment while he slept. "I'll be fine," she said. Ji-won tilted his head, that patronizing degree of tilt that men use when they're about to explain something to a woman who didn't ask. "I just want to make sure you have realistic expectations," he said. "The settlement is modest. It's what I could offer given." Ji-won, he stopped. "I didn't ask," she said. She turned back toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Yuna say something low and sharp to Ji-won in Korean, something that ended with the word pathetic. But Amara could not tell which of them Yuna was referring to, and she did not stop to find out. The courthouse steps were cold, the kind of cold that gets into the collar and the wrists and finds every gap in your coat. Amara stopped at the bottom of the steps and breathed for a moment. This was the moment she had planned for 6 months. Every scenario, every possible way Ji-won might react. Every contingency Soo-jin had mapped out, and every variable Elias had tracked. She had been so focused on the execution that she had not fully allowed herself to sit with the fact that this was also, whatever else it was, the end of 7 years. She did not love Ji-won anymore. She was certain of that. She had stopped loving him in the specific way you stop loving someone when you see who they really are underneath the version they showed you, not all at once but in accumulations. Small revelations that stack like stones until the weight becomes undeniable. But she had loved the idea of him. She had loved who she thought he was. In the first 2 years, before the syndicate business began consuming everything, before the late nights became a lifestyle rather than an exception, before the warmth in his eyes got replaced by something colder and more calculating. She had loved that version of him and grieved him quietly for a long time while still living in the same house. She was done grieving now. She had given herself exactly 30 seconds for this. She'd decided that months standing in her penthouse bathroom at 2A, while Ji-won was somewhere else. 30 seconds for whatever needed to move through her at this moment. She counted. Then she lifted her chin and stepped forward. The black luxury sedan was already at the curb. It was a Genesis G90, matte black, one of the new long wheelbase configurations that companies used for executive transportation. The kind of vehicle that cost more than some people's condos, and that announced, without speaking, that the person inside occupied a different stratum of existence. The driver was young, maybe 28, sharply dressed in a charcoal uniform. He stepped out the moment Amara reached the bottom step. He didn't wait. He moved with the precision of someone who had been told exactly when and where she would appear. He bowed, not the casual bob of a service worker being professional. A genuine bow, low, deliberate. "Ms. Belrose," he said in clear, accented English. "Chairman Han sends his regards. He's waiting at the Hanum office when you're ready." Amara nodded once and stepped toward the vehicle. She heard Ji-won's voice behind her close, which meant he had followed her down the steps. "Who is that?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ji-won stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps and watched the door close behind her, and in the 3 seconds between the door closing and the sedan pulling away, he experienced something he did not have a name for yet. But that lived somewhere between confusion and the first cold breath of something worse. Through the tinted rear window he could see not clearly, but enough, the outline of a woman in a charcoal blazer being handed something. Documents, a leather portfolio. A man in a suit turning toward her from across the seat with the body language of someone who had been waiting, not as a subordinate waits, but as an equal waits, as a partner waits, as someone who understood exactly who had just gotten into that car. The sedan pulled into traffic. Ji-won stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold. Yuna appeared beside him. "Who was that driver?" "I don't know," he said. That was the second time in his adult life he had said those words and felt genuinely disturbed by them. The first was the morning, 3 years ago, when he had gone through Amara's things looking for something. He didn't even remember what now, some bill, some insurance document, and had found a second phone he did not recognize and almost confronted her about it, and then decided she was too careful, too quiet, too loyal to be hiding anything, and had put it back and never mentioned it. He stood on the steps for another few seconds. Then his own phone buzzed. "His financial manager's number," he answered. "Mr. Kang." The man's voice was careful in the way that meant something had already gone wrong. "I've been trying to reach you. There's a situation with 3 of the personal accounts. It appears the automatic transfers that were managing the liability overrides overrides have been discontinued, and the accounts are now showing deficit balances because the beast." "What transfers?" A pause. "The ones from the Belrose account management side. The quarterly adjustments. They've been running for about 5 years. Mr. Kang, I assumed you knew about them. They were routed through a separate authorization I need to understand if..." Ji-won hung up. He stood very still. 5 years. Quarterly adjustments. Amara had been managing his liability structures through channels he did not know existed, and she had stopped quietly. The same day she signed the divorce papers, and the accounts were already showing the gap. He looked at the place where the black sedan had been. It was gone. The street was ordinary traffic, taxis and commuters and delivery trucks, and the grinding ordinary motion of a city that didn't care about any of this. Ji-won Kang, the man who ran the Baekryu syndicate, who had brought grown men to their knees with a single phone call, stood at the bottom of Seoul Family Court's front steps and felt the first edge of something he had not felt since he was 19 years old and had nothing. He felt exposed. Inside the G90, Amara accepted the leather portfolio from Han Min-jae's senior assistant, a capable woman named Dae Young, who had been briefed on everything and opened to the first tab. The Hongdae Mixed-Use Development Proposal. Final review before the board meeting. She read. The city moved past the windows. Somewhere behind her, the courthouse shrank and disappeared and became just another building in a city full of buildings, none of them hers yet, all of them potential. Her phone buzzed. Sujin, it's done. Everything's clean. Congratulations, Amara. She typed back 3 words, thank you. Finally, then she put the phone face down on the seat beside her and returned to the proposal. She had a meeting in 40 minutes. She had a company to run. She had a life to build, not reconstruct, not reclaim, but actually build from the foundation she had been laying for 4 years in the hours. Ji-won never noticed. In the accounts he never asked about. In the rooms he never entered because he assumed a quiet woman was a simple woman, and that assumption had cost him more than he was prepared to understand yet. But that understanding was coming. It was already on its way. 12 blocks from the courthouse, in a glass-walled conference room, on the 28th floor of a building whose lobby featured a marble installation that cost more than the Masbogu apartment, Han Min-jae was standing at a floor-to-ceiling window looking at the Han River when his assistant texted him 2 words, she's en route. He didn't smile. He was not a man who smiled reflexively at things he had been expecting. But something in his posture shifted to the faint adjustment of a person who has been waiting for something and is now willing to be still. He was 46 years old. Korean-American, raised in Los Angeles, educated in New York, returned to Seoul 8 years ago with the specific intention of doing something that mattered with the capital he had accumulated. He had a reputation in the industry for being fair in a sector where fairness was treated as a liability. A sound over the past 11 months, he had also over the professional relationship with Belrose Meridian Holdings that had made him pay very close attention to the woman who ran it. Not because she was impressive. Impressive was a word for conference panels and magazine profiles. Because she was right. Consistently, stubbornly, sometimes infuriatingly, right about markets and timing and the kinds of invisible community dynamics that most developers bulldozed because they couldn't put a number on them. A sound like green wood splitting. She had a way of seeing what a neighborhood needed before the neighborhood could articulate it, and she built for that need rather than for the return model that everyone else was using. And somehow, against the projections of 3 separate analysts who had been certain she was overleveraged, it worked. He had asked her once over a working lunch in a restaurant she'd chosen because it was close to her second site, and she wanted to check something on the way back, how she'd developed that instinct. She had said, after a pause, I grew up watching my grandmother talk to people before she bought anything. Not research, just talking, finding out what they actually needed. She said if you understand what people need, you don't have to guess what will last. He had thought about that answer more than was probably professionally appropriate. He turned from the window when his assistant opened the conference room door. Amara walked in. She still had the blazer on. Her eyes were clear and direct, in the way they always were. But there was something else today, a specific quality of arrival, like someone who had just run a very long race and had not yet slowed down to feel their legs. How did it go, he asked. It's done, she said. She set the portfolio on the table. Walk me through the Hongdae numbers. He studied her for exactly 1 second. Then he moved to the table and opened his laptop. They had work to do. In the weeks that followed, Ji-won made several attempts to understand what had happened. He sent a message through a mutual contact asking for a meeting. Sujin replied on Amara's behalf with 2 sentences. Belrose has no outstanding matters to discuss. Please direct future inquiries to legal counsel. He had his financial team dig through the accounts they knew about and found, over the course of 3 weeks, the edges of something they couldn't fully trace structures set up under a name they half recognized, Belrose Meridian Holdings, registered in Seoul's commercial district. with a portfolio that did not align with what any of them had imagined a woman in Amara's position could have assembled. One of his associates pulled a business listing. CEO Amara Belrose. Founded 4 years ago. Estimated holdings, multiple commercial and residential properties across Seoul, with an expansion into international markets. Ji-won looked at the listing for a long time. He thought about the second phone he had found 3 years ago and put back without asking. He thought of the quarterly transfers. His financial manager had mentioned 5 years of quiet management, invisible to him, because it was handled by someone he had never asked to explain herself. He thought about standing on the courthouse steps watching a Genesis G90 pull away from the curb, with a driver who bowed and a man in a suit waiting on the other side of the door. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with grief, splitting, but with the specific absence of both that told you a person had finished something inside themselves a long time ago and had simply been waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He picked up his phone and called his financial manager back. "The accounts," he said. "How bad is it?" The number his manager gave him was bad enough that he had to sit down. Not ruined, not yet, but the scaffolding was compromised in ways that would take years to rebuild. Because Amara had not done anything aggressive or visible, she had simply stopped doing the quiet work that kept the system functional, and in her absence, the gaps were everywhere. He hung up. He sat in the office of the syndicate's main building, a place he had spent a decade, filling with influence and fear, and the particular gravity of a man who believed power was permanent, and he thought about the woman who had signed her name at 1147A. And walked out of a courthouse into a car that wasn't waiting for her. It was waiting for Amara Belrose, the woman behind the name he had never bothered to fully understand. That night, Yuna came to the apartment and found Ji-won sitting at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him, not eating the dinner she had ordered, not looking at her when she came in. "What happened?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "What do you know about Belrose Meridian Holdings?" he finally said. Yuna blinked. "What?" He slid his phone across the table toward her. The business listing was open. She read it. Her expression shifted through several things in quick succession confusion, then something she would not have named out loud. "Is this Amara's company?" "Yes." A silence. "Since when?" 4 years ago, he said. "At least 4 years ago. Maybe longer." Yuna set the phone down carefully. Outside, Seoul kept moving traffic and rain, and the low, steady hum of a city that did not organize itself around any particular person's reckoning. Ji-won looked at the phone and thought about the woman who had signed those papers without looking at him once. He had believed she was leaving with nothing. He had believed, on some level, that she needed what he provided. He had spent 7 years in the same house as someone who had been quietly building something extraordinary, and he had never once been curious enough to ask. He picked up the phone. He started reading. Ji-won did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m. A sound like green wood splitting, reading everything he could find about Belrose Meridian Holdings, and the more he read, the worse it got. Not because the company was doing anything illegal or aggressive, but because it was doing everything right. And it had been doing everything right for 4 years, while he sat in the same house and never once thought to ask his wife what she did when he wasn't home. The portfolio was not enormous by the standards of Seoul's major developers, but it was solid, in a way that took time and discipline and a specific kind of intelligence to build properties in neighborhoods that had been undervalued 3 years ago and were now appreciating steadily. Commercial spaces leased to businesses with 5-year contracts. A residential complex in Mafia that had been renovated and was now 87% occupied at rates above the area average. None of it flashy, all of it durable. He found a brief profile in a Korean business journal from 8 months ago. It was a short half a page, with a small photograph of Amara at what appeared to be a construction site walkthrough. She was wearing a hard hat and holding a blueprint and listening to someone off camera with the focused attention of a woman who had already read the document and was now checking it against the physical reality in front of her. The caption read, "Amara Belrose, founder and CEO of Belrose Meridian Holdings, whose recent Mafia residential project has drawn attention from institutional investors." 8 months ago. He had been living with her 8 months ago. He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate the specific moment when he had decided she was not someone who required his attention or his curiosity or his respect. And he could not find a single moment because it had not been a moment. It had been an accumulation of small dismissals, each one so minor that he hadn't registered it as a choice. He simply had not asked. That was the whole of it. He simply had not asked. Yuna left early the next morning, which was unusual. Normally she stayed, made coffee, moved through the apartment with the particular ease of a woman who was comfortable in a space she had been introduced to gradually, and then all at once. But that morning she was dressed and reaching for her bag before Jiwon was fully awake. "You're going?" he said. "I have a meeting," she said. She didn't look at him. He watched her pull her coat on the cream wool coat and felt something shift his chest that he couldn't name yet, but would recognize later as the beginning of a problem. "The meeting," he said. "With who?" "A colleague," she said. "I'll call you later." She was gone before he finished the sentence he'd started. Jiwon sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet apartment and thought about the fact that he had spent 7 years not asking questions, and now he was watching the pattern repeat itself, and he was already too tired to know what to do about it. His first meeting of the morning was with Baek Sung-ho, his senior lieutenant in the syndicate's Eastern District operations. Baek was 53, thick-necked, with a scar along his left jawline from something that had happened before Jiwon's time, and he had been with the Bakryu organization for 18 years. He was loyal in the specific way that men who had nowhere else to go were loyal completely, and with the low-grade resentment that came from knowing it. They met at a private room in a restaurant in Gangnam that Jiwon's organization owned through a hospitality holding company. The kind of place that didn't appear on food delivery apps and whose staff had all signed NDAs. Baek poured tea without being asked. "The Yongsasan contracts," Jiwon said. "There's a problem," Baek said. He set the teapot down. "Choi's people are saying the payments were supposed to come through the Meridian account." Jiwon went very still. "What account?" he said. Baek looked at him with the expression of a man who had just stepped on something and was not yet sure of the damage. "The Meridian routing, the one your wife managed. It's been handling the Yongsan liability transfers," for he paused, checking something in his head, "about 3 years. The payments were scheduled on a quarterly basis. The last one was supposed to go through 2 days ago." "It didn't go through," Jiwon said. "It was not a question." "No," Baek said. "Choi's people are calling it a breach. They want a meeting." Jiwon looked at his tea. The Yongsan contracts were not small. They were part of a 3-year arrangement with a construction consortium that operated on the edge of legal and had been doing so profitably for everyone involved. The liability transfers were how the organization kept that particular arrangement. Quiet, routed through financial structures that created enough distance that no one could draw a straight line. Structures that Amara had been managing, not because he'd asked her to, not because she'd volunteered. Because at some point, 3 or 4 years ago, she had seen the gap in his financial architecture, and quietly, without announcement, begun filling it. And he had noticed that certain things were running more smoothly without knowing why, and had not asked, because he was a man who did not ask questions of women he had decided were not complicated. "Set up the meeting with Choi," Jiwon said, "this week. He wants it today then." Jiwon pushed his chair back. "And Baek, yes, don't tell anyone else about the account situation." Baek looked at him steadily. "Already handled." Jiwon stood and left the room. In the hallway, he pressed one hand flat against the wall and breathed. Just breathed. The wall was cool and solid, and he needed something solid because the ground under everything he had built was shifting in ways he was only beginning to map. Amara, at that same moment, was sitting in a boardroom on the 28th floor of a Hanam-gu office building, presenting the third quarter performance review to 4 investors who represented a portfolio that could have purchased the restaurant where Jiwon had just been sitting several times over. She was not nervous. She had been nervous the first time she did this 18 months ago in a smaller room with less money on the table and everything feeling fragile. She remembered the specific quality of that nervousness, the careful breathing, the awareness of her own hands. The low-grade calculation of how she was being perceived by people who had not decided yet whether to take her seriously. She was not that woman anymore. Or rather she was, but she had learned to move through the nervousness rather than around it, and in doing so had discovered that the nervousness itself was useful, kept her sharp, kept her honest about the numbers. She pulled up the Mapogu occupancy slide. 87%, said one of the investors, a Korean-Canadian woman named Grace Lim, who ran a mid-sized private equity fund and asked better questions than anyone else in the room. That's above the area average by what? 11%, Amara said. And we're projecting 92 by the end of Q1. What's driving the overage? Mix, Amara said. We weighted the units toward smaller configurations, 1 and 2 bedroom, because the demographic data for that corridor showed high demand from single professionals and young couples. Developers in the area were mostly building 3-bedroom family units because that's what the previous decade looked like. We looked at what the next 5 years looked like instead. Grace made a note. Belrose, said another investor, a man named Taehyun Park, who managed institutional money and asked questions like he was trying to catch you in something. Walk me through the Hongdae projection again. The timeline concerns me. Which part of the timeline? The 18-month development window. It's tight for mixed use of that scale. It's tight, Amara agreed. That's intentional. We structured the contractor agreements around milestone payments that create pressure on the schedule without compromising the build quality. I can walk you through the penalty clauses if that would help. Please. She walked him through the penalty clauses. Taehyun Park stopped looking like he was trying to catch her in something and started looking like a man who was recalculating. Beside her, Dae-young had the backup slides ready before Amara asked for them. The meeting ran 20 minutes over schedule because the investors kept asking questions, which was the best possible outcome. Afterward, in the elevator, Dae-young handed her a coffee and a message printed on paper, which meant it was something Dae-young had decided was better delivered without a digital trail. Amara read it. It was from Elias Park. 3 inquiries about BM Holdings in the last 24 hours. 2 from financial search databases, 1 from a private IP that traces back to a known Baekryu-affiliated address. They're looking. Recommend accelerating the Jeju registration. She folded the paper in half and put it in her blazer pocket. She had expected this. She heard like green wood, splitting. She had told Elias 3 weeks ago that within 48 hours of the divorce being finalized, Jiwon would start trying to understand what he'd missed, and that the search would begin with the financial structures and move outward. Move the Jeju registration to Thursday, she told Dae-young. Already scheduled, Dae-young said. The elevator doors opened. Amara stepped out into the lobby and felt the November air from the building's entrance moving through the space, cold and clean, and thought about Elias's note and what it meant that Jiwon was already looking. Not threatened, not afraid, just aware that the clock had started and that there were things still in motion that needed to be completed before his curiosity became something more organized. Jiwon met with Jung-soo that afternoon in a parking structure in Yeouido, which was where Choi preferred to do business because he had a fixation with spaces that had multiple exit points. Choi was 60, ran a construction consortium that operated under 4 different company names, and had the flat, measuring affect of a man who had survived a great deal by being willing to do things others weren't. They stood between 2 vehicles. Choi's driver and Jiwon's driver waited at opposite ends of the level. The fluorescent lights in the parking structure buzzed, and one of them flickered at irregular intervals which Choi did not appear to notice. The transfer didn't clear, Choi said. I know, Jiwon said. That's the 3rd quarter. You told me this arrangement was stable. It is stable. There was an administrative change on my end. It'll be resolved. Choi looked at him without expression for a long moment. Administrative change. Yes. Your divorce was finalized yesterday. Jiwon said nothing. I keep track of things, Choi said. It's how I've survived this long. Your wife was managing the routing. Now your wife is gone. Is that the administrative change? The flickering light buzzed above them. The routing will be handled through a different structure, Jiwon-sen said. Give me 2 weeks. I'll give you 10 days, Choi said. After 10 days, I start having conversations with other people about alternative arrangements for the Yongsan contracts. And those conversations won't include you. He walked back to his vehicle without waiting for a response. Ji-won stood in the parking structure and watched Choi's car descend to the exit ramp. 10 days. He had known this would happen. He had known in the abstract that Amara's departure would create gaps. He had not known, had refused to know how many gaps there were, or how deep they went, or how long she had been quietly holding things together that he had assumed were simply functional, by design, rather than by her effort. He walked back to his own car. In the back seat, he called his financial manager. "What do you need to rebuild the Yongsan routing without the Belrose account?" he said. A pause, the sound of keyboard movement. "It's not straightforward," his manager said carefully. The structures she built where they were efficient. Whoever set them up understood how to minimize exposure at each layer. To rebuild something equivalent, we'd need, how long? Minimum 6 weeks, possibly 8. And there are 3 other arrangements that were running through similar structures that would also need. Give me the list. Another pause. Mr. Kang, some of these involve parties who are going to ask questions we may not want to answer. Give me the list, Ji-won said again. The list, when it came through an hour later, had 11 items on it. 11 separate operational arrangements that Amara had been quietly managing for what his financial manager estimated was between 3 and 5 years, threading payments through structures that kept the syndicate's legitimate business surface clean while the underlying arrangements stayed invisible. Ji-won read the list twice. A sound sign. He thought about the morning years ago now, but he could still locate it in memory when he had come home early to find Amara at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and 3 physical folders spread across the surface. And he had asked what she was working on, and she had said consulting work. And he had accepted that without another question, and gone to the refrigerator for water. She had been building this while he watched. She had been protecting him, in a way, while building her own empire, and she had done both so quietly that he had taken the protection as ambient, and never looked at it directly, never valued it, never once thought to ask whether the woman he was dismissing might be the reason certain things worked. He set his phone down. Outside, Seoul was moving into the late afternoon, the particular gray-gold light of November, the city's rhythms shifting toward evening, traffic thickening on the bridge over the Han. He thought about Yuna's face that morning, the coat she'd worn, the way she hadn't looked at him. He picked up his phone and called her. It rang 4 times. Voicemail. Yuna Seo was at that moment sitting in a cafe in Insadong with a woman named Cho Mirei, who was a journalist for a business and culture publication that operated somewhere between legitimate media and strategic narrative management for people who could afford to pay for both. Yuna had contacted Mirei 3 days ago. She had not told Ji-won. "Tell me more about the holdings," Mirei said. She had a voice recorder on the table between them, small and black. "The scope. I don't have exact numbers," Yuna said. "But it's significant. Multiple properties in Seoul. Possibly more outside the country. And the ex-husband, had no idea. None." Mirei tapped the recorder with one finger, thinking, "What's your interest in this?" Yuna wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She had thought about how to answer this question before she came. But sitting here with the recorder on the table between them, she found the prepared answer felt thin. The honest answer was more complicated. The honest answer was that she had spent 6 months helping Ji-won believe that Amara was nothing, and she had believed it too, because it was easier to believe, because if Amara was nothing, then what Yuna had done was a minor disruption rather than a significant one, and now Amara turned out to be something considerable. Something that had been there the whole time. And Yuna needed to understand the shape of it before Ji-won did, because information was the only leverage she had that he didn't. "Professional interest," she said. "The story of a woman who built something in secret, while everyone assumed she had nothing. It's a good story." Mirei smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to find it useful. "It is a good story. I want it told carefully," Yuna said. "Of course. And I want to know about it before it goes anywhere." Mirei picked up the recorder and clicked it off. "That's a different arrangement." "Yes," Yuna said, "it is." Amara found out about the cafe meeting 40 hours later. Elias Park called her directly, which he only did for things that needed immediate attention. Mire was asking about you, he said. Met with a source I've been tracking. The source is someone from Jiwon's immediate circle. Who? A brief pause, Yuniseo. Amara sat very still in her office chair. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Han River was flat and gray in the mid-morning light. What was she asking about? Holding scope. The gap between what Jiwon knew and what actually exists. Elias's voice was even and precise, the voice of a man who delivered information the way a surgeon used instruments without drama, with complete attention. Mire is not immediately dangerous, but if she starts pulling threads on Belrose Meridian Holdings before the Jeju registration is complete and the Singapore partnership is finalized, there's exposure. How much time do we have? Mire is careful. She won't publish anything that isn't completely sourced. That gives us maybe 3 weeks before the story is solid enough to move. 3 weeks is enough, Amara said. It's enough if nothing else moves first, Elias said. Jiwon is starting to understand the scope of what you were managing. When he finishes that inventory, he may make a move. What kind of move? I don't know yet. But men like Jiwon, when they feel backed into something they don't think clearly, they act fast and they act from pride. That's when they make mistakes. Amara thought about Jiwon at the courthouse steps. The particular look on his face when the G90 pulled away. The look of a man who had just realized the story he'd been telling himself was not the story that was true. Keep watching the Baekryu accounts, she said. If anything moves toward BM Holdings, any probe, any legal motion, anything I need to know within the hour. Understood. She ended the call. She sat for a moment looking at the river. Yuna was talking. That was interesting and complicated. And Amara was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this somewhat painful in a way she had not expected. Because Yuna being willing to move against Jiwon meant that whatever Yuna had believed the situation was, she was now recalibrating. And people who recalibrated quickly were unpredictable. They could be useful. They could be destructive. They could be both, sometimes at the same time. Amara pulled up the Jeju registration documents on her laptop. She read through them carefully. There was one clause in the secondary holding structure that Sujin had flagged as potentially needing revision, a jurisdiction question about international transfers, that, if challenged, could create a 3-week delay. She emailed Sujin, "Can we talk today?" The jurisdiction clause. "I think we need to move faster." Sujin's reply came in 4 minutes. "I'll be there at 2. Sujin arrived at 2 hour, which was as close to exactly on time as Amara had ever seen her manage. She was a small woman, 44, sharp-featured, with reading glasses. She wore pushed up on her head like a headband and dropped to her nose when she was about to say something you needed to write down. She dropped the glasses before she sat. "Yuniseo is talking to journalists," Amara said, before Sujin could open her folder. Sujin looked at her. "Since when?" "Since 2 days ago." "She met with Mire." "Mire is Thurtho," Sujin said without inflection. "She'll want hard documentation before she moves." "I know, but the Jeju registration has a weakness." Amara turned her laptop and showed Sujin the clause. "If someone challenges the international transfer structure before Thursday." Sujin pulled the laptop toward her and read. The office was quiet. Someone in the corridor was having a conversation in low voices. Outside, a cloud moved across the sun and the river went darker. "Okay," Sujin said. "This is fixable, but we need to file an amendment and have the primary documents complete before the challenge can be lodged, meaning we need everything done by Wednesday." "Not Thursday." "Wednesday," Amara repeated. "Wednesday morning. Which means you need to be at the registration office when it opens." Sujin looked at her over the glasses. "Can you do that?" "Yes. And you need to sign the Singapore partnership agreement today." "Not this week, today." Amara looked at her calendar. She had 2 site visits and a call with Grace Lim's fund manager. "Move the site visits," Sujin said, reading her face. "I can't move both. Move one. The second one. Whoever it is, they can wait." Sujin closed the laptop. "Amara, if Mire finds the Jeju structure before it's properly registered and brings it to Jiwon's attorneys as a challenge point, they might be able to create an argument that some of the holdings fall within the divorce settlement window. It's a weak argument, but it's the kind of weak argument that still costs you 6 months and 200,000 in legal fees. Amara looked at her. Sujin looked back. Singapore today, Amara said. Wednesday morning for Jeju. Good. Sujin picked up her folder and stood. And Amara, whatever Jiwon is doing right now, he's going to do something more visible soon. Men like him can't sit with uncertainty for long. When he moves, let him move. Don't react. Let the structure absorb it. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway because you're human and he was your husband, and there will be a moment when it's personal, even though you've decided it isn't. Amara was quiet for a second. He had Yuna call me weak, she said. It came out more evenly than it felt, in their messages. Predictable. A woman who would never survive without him. Sujin looked at her for a moment. Let him think that, she said. Let him keep thinking that. Every minute he believes that story is a minute that works in your favor. She left. Amara sat in the quiet office for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the Singapore contact. Jiwon received the financial inventory on a Wednesday morning, 11 pages, itemized, showing the full scope of what his team had been able to map of Amara's quiet operational contributions over the past several years. His financial manager delivered it in person, which was itself a signal that the document contained things that should not exist in any digital communication. Jiwon read through it at his desk. By page 3, he was no longer reading, in order he was flipping pages, checking dates, trying to locate the beginning of something that turned out to have no clear beginning, just a gradual accumulation of competence that had filled gaps he hadn't known were gaps. By page 7, he put the document down. He looked at his financial manager, who was sitting across the desk with the expression of a man who had survived difficult conversations before and was managing this one the same way. She was managing all of this, Jiwon said. Yes. For how long? The earliest transaction we can trace is approximately 5 years ago. But the structure, the way the routing was set up, suggests she understood how it worked before she began managing it. Which means the knowledge goes back further, possibly to the beginning of the marriage. Jiwon sat very still. She never said anything, he said. No, she just did it. From what we can see, yes. He picked up page 7 again. A sound like greenwood splitting, a list of 8 separate financial arrangements that had been running through routing structures connected to accounts. Amara managed under her own name, and the Belrose Meridian Holdings, structure invisible to him because they were professionally structured, and because he had never looked, and she had never told him. She had protected his operation, while he was having an affair, while he was planning to replace her. She had continued doing the quiet, competent, invisible work of keeping the financial scaffolding sound, and she had said nothing. And she had signed the divorce papers and walked out and stopped the work at exactly the moment the papers were finalized, and the gaps were already showing and would continue to show for months. Get me back, he said. His manager left. Jiwon stood and went to the window. The city was mid-morning, bright pale winter sun on glass and concrete, the particular clarity of cold air. He thought about Amara sitting at that kitchen table with her laptop and 3 folders, and himself walking to the refrigerator, and the word she had used, consulting work, and how completely he had accepted it. Behind him the door opened. Baek came in and closed it. We have a problem, Jiwon said, still facing the window. I heard. Jiwon turned. Who else knows? On our side? Me, your manager, and the 2 analysts who ran the inventory. I told them it stays internal. Make sure of it. Already done. Baek sat without being asked, which he only did when what he was about to say was something Jiwon needed to be sitting still to hear. Something else. Jiwon said nothing. Cho Mi-rae filed a request for public business records on Belrose Meridian Holdings this morning, Baek said. Which means she's putting a story together. I know. You know who her source is? Jiwon looked at him. Baek's expression was flat and careful. Yuna, Jiwon said. It was not a question. Baek nodded once. Jiwon moved back to his desk and sat down. He put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment, the particular gesture of a man who is counting something internally, something that isn't numbers. Yuna. He had brought Yuna into the space that Amara had left, and Yuna was already talking to journalists about what she had seen while she was there. The woman he'd chosen over the woman he had. What does Yuna actually know? He said. She knows you didn't know about the holdings, Spake said. She knows the scope of the operation is significant. She probably knows about the financial gap. She's been in the apartment. She's heard your calls. Ji-won thought about the morning Yuna had left early. The way she hadn't looked at him. She hadn't been going to a meeting. She had already made the appointment with Mirai. She had been managing her exit, the way people managed exits when they had decided something privately and were only waiting for the logistics to align. He had not asked again. He had not asked. What do you want to do? Baek said. Ji-won looked up. The question sat between them in the quiet office, and Ji-won understood that the answer he gave in this moment would determine the shape of everything that came after, not because one decision was clean and one was messy, but because all of the available decisions were messy now, and the only variable was what kind of mess he was willing to own. He thought about Choi in the parking structure. 10 days. The Yongsan contracts. The 11 items on the financial inventory. The 6 to 8 weeks his manager said it would take to rebuild the routing structures. He thought about Amara's face at the courthouse, the absolute absence of anger in it. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for every version of it. Splitting. He had walked into a situation she had already mapped, and he was standing in the middle of her map, and every move he made from this point would be a move she had already accounted for. He felt something that was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood. Set up a meeting with Yuna, he said quietly. Baek looked at him. Tonight, Ji-won said. Baek nodded and stood, and Baek Ji-won's voice was flat. Don't tell her why. The door closed. Ji-won sat alone in his office, with the 11-page inventory on his desk, and the particular silence of a man who has just understood, for the first time, that the woman he discarded was the one who had been holding the floor beneath him, and the floor was already starting to go. The meeting with Yuna did not go the way Ji-won planned. He had arranged it at the restaurant, in Gangnam, the private room, the same table he used for business conversations that needed walls around them. He arrived first, which he always did, because arriving first was a form of control, and he needed control tonight more than he had needed it in a long time. He ordered water. He sat with his back to the wall. He waited. Yuna arrived 11 minutes late, which was also a form of control, and he recognized it because he had taught her that, in the early months, when he was still the kind of man who enjoyed watching someone learn from him. She sat down across from him without taking her coat off. That was the first signal. People who intended to stay took their coats off. You met with Cho Mirai, he said. He had decided on the direct approach because he didn't have time for the other kind, and because Yuna was smart enough that the end approach would have told her more than he wanted her to know. She looked at him without blinking. Who told you that? Doesn't matter who told me. It matters to me. Yuna. I went for coffee with someone I know, she said. That's not a crime. You talked about Amara, about the holdings, about what you've seen in this apartment. Her jaw moved slightly. Not quite a tell. Yuna was too careful for tells, but an acknowledgement. I talked about a lot of things. What did you tell her? She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment, Ji-won saw something in her face that he had not seen before, not fear, not guilt, but a specific kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had been performing something for too long and had recently decided to stop. I told her the truth, Yuna said. That Amara Belrose built something significant while you weren't paying attention. That the woman you spent 6 months calling weak has a company worth tens of millions of won. That the divorce settlement you were so proud of was a joke. She picked up the water glass and sat down without drinking from it. I didn't say anything that isn't already publicly available if someone knows where to look. You gave her the frame, Ji-won said. Mirai doesn't need documents. She needs a story. You gave her the story. Somebody was going to. The words landed flat and even, and Ji-won felt them land. Why, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Not angry. Something more exposed than anger. Yuna looked at him across the table, and for a moment the performance dropped entirely. The elegant composure, the carefully maintained confidence, and what was underneath was something more honest and more tired than anything she had shown him in 6 months. Because I sat in that apartment and watched you read that business profile, she said. And I saw your face. And I understood, Jiwon, I understood what I had actually helped you do. Not just to her, to yourself. She pushed her chair back slightly. I'm not a journalist. I'm not trying to damage you. I was trying to understand something, and Mi Ray was the person I called. You were trying to understand something, he repeated. Yes, by talking to a journalist, by talking to someone who knew how to find information I couldn't find myself. Jiwon looked at her. He thought about the cream wool coat. He thought about the morning she had left early without looking at him. He thought about all the things he had not asked. What did you find? He said. Yuna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, more than you want to know tonight. She stood, and this time she did not wait for him to say anything. She pulled her coat tighter and walked out of the private room. Through the glass panel beside the door, Jiwon watched her move through the restaurant toward the exit with the particular walk of someone who has made a decision recently and is still getting used to the weight of it. The door to the private room swung closed. Jiwon sat alone with the water and the 11-page inventory in his jacket pocket and the specific silence of a man who has just lost 2 women in the space of 48 hours, both of them walking away from him while he sat still. He drove himself home, which he almost never did. He usually had a driver for evenings, because evenings had a way of requiring him to be on his phone, and he had learned a long time ago not to split his attention behind the wheel. But tonight he needed his hands on something, and the road was the only thing available. He took the long route, following the river, and the Han was black and flat under the bridge lights, and he drove without music and without calls for 20 minutes, which was the closest he had come to silence in years. He thought about what Yuna had said, more than you want to know tonight. She had found something specific. She had the careful, contained affect of someone managing a piece of information rather than expressing a feeling, and Yuna's not normally a woman who managed information. She was a woman who deployed it quickly for effect. The fact that she had not deployed it tonight meant it was something she hadn't decided how to use yet, or something she didn't know how to tell him. He pulled into the underground parking of the apartment building and sat in the car for a moment after the engine was off. His phone was full of messages he hadn't answered. His financial manager, Baek, 2 missed calls from Choi's assistant, which meant the 10-day clock was ticking faster than Choi had said. The weight of all of it sat on the outside of his chest, like something physical like weather. He got out of the car, rode the elevator up in silence. The apartment was dark. He had stopped thinking of it as home sometime. In the last 3 days, it was just a space now, a set of rooms that needed to be transitioned out of, a stage that the play had already left. He turned on the kitchen light. On the counter was a folder. He didn't remember leaving a folder there. He crossed the kitchen and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead. Printed text, maybe 8 lines. He read it. He read it again. Then he sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, on the floor, his back against the cabinet, because his legs made a decision his mind hadn't authorized. The paper was from Baek. Delivered through the financial manager, through any financial channel, Baek had come to the apartment himself and left it on the counter because what was on the paper could not exist in any system that could be searched later. It was a summary of what Elias Park Amara's investigator had found and compiled over the course of 6 months before the divorce. Baek had obtained it through a contact inside a records firm that had processed some of the documentation. Jiwon had known Amara hired an investigator. He had known about the photographs and the messages and the financial records she had brought to the divorce proceedings. That was not new. What was new was the last 4 lines of the summary. The investigator had found in the course of tracking Jiwon's financial movements a set of transactions that predated the affair by 2 years. Transactions that ran from a holding account, connected to the Baekryu syndicate through a series of shell companies to a final destination that the investigator had flagged as potentially significant to regulatory authorities. The investigator had flagged it, and then he had filed it. Not with Jiwon's attorneys, not with the divorce court. With the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit, 6 weeks ago. Jiwon sat on the kitchen floor and read the last 4 lines 3 times. His investigator Baek's contact believed the KFIU filing was preliminary, a preservation of record rather than an active case. But preliminary filings of that kind had a way of becoming active cases when the right person at the right agency decided to look at them. And if someone was looking, the transactions in question were not things that could be explained away. They were things that required the kind of explanation that took years and cost everything. He had been aware in the abstract that the syndicate's financial operations carried regulatory risk. Every operation of its kind carried that risk. But the particular transactions flagged in the summary were ones he had believed were clean structured by a financial architect he had paid well and trusted completely, a man named Jiwon who had run the Baekryu organization's money for 8 years. Jiwon. Jiwon looked at the paper. The transactions had been structured by Jiwon. And Jiwon had known, when he structured them, that they would not survive close regulatory scrutiny. And Jiwon had structured them anyway. Why? Jiwon thought about Jiwon. 60 years old, fastidious dresser, a man who counted things receipts, minutes, words with the precision of someone who did not trust approximations. He had been with the organization since the beginning, since before Jiwon took control, had stayed through 2 leadership transitions and 3 regulatory close calls, and had always found the path that kept the organization clear. Why would Jiwon structure something that would not hold? Jiwon pressed the paper flat against his knee. There were 2 possible answers. 1, Jiwon had made an error, miscalculated the exposure. 2, Jiwon had structured it that way deliberately. Created a liability that could be triggered, filed with the right authority at the right moment by someone who knew where to look and had a reason to look. If the second answer was true, then Jiwon was not an 8-year loyalist. Jiwon was a problem that had been sitting inside the organization for 8 years, waiting. He called Baek at midnight. Baek answered on the first ring, which meant Baek had been awake waiting. The summary, Jiwon said, I know, the transactions. Jiwon structured those. Yes. Why didn't you know about the KFIU filing? A pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know the answer, the pause of someone who had been sitting with the answer and not liking it. Because the filing was made through a channel that bypassed our standard monitoring. Whoever made it knew which channel to use. Elias Park knew which channel to use, Jiwon said. Elias Park is good, Baek said, but the specific channel he used, that's not something an outside investigator would know. That's institutional knowledge, meaning someone told him. Meaning someone who understood the organization's monitoring structure told him where the gap was. Jiwon felt the cold from the kitchen floor moving through his suit jacket. Someone inside, he said. That's what it looks like. Jiwon, another pause. Shorter this time. That's the most direct line. Jiwon closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about 8 years. 8 years of meetings and decisions and the kind of trust that built up like sediment, invisible, assumed, load-bearing. Where is Jiwon now? He said. That's the other thing. Baek's voice was careful in the way it got when the news was layered. He missed the Tuesday standing meeting. His assistant said he was traveling. I sent someone to his apartment this morning. And he left. Looks like 3 or 4 days ago. Apartments cleared out. Not packed cleared. Like he'd been preparing for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. Jiwon opened his eyes. He's gone, he said. Yes. He knew we'd find the summary. He had to know eventually. He probably had a timeline. Baek's voice dropped slightly. Jiwon. If Jiwon built this thing deliberately, if he's been managing this liability for years, and then handed the trigger to Amara's investigator, that means this was planned. A long time ago. The question is who Jiwon was working for. Jiwon stood up from the kitchen floor. His legs were stiff from the cold tile. Find him, he said. I'm already looking. Find him fast, Baek. If the KFIU moves from preliminary to active before we understand what Jiwon built, we lose control of the timeline entirely. I understand. And don't tell anyone else. Not the analysts. Not the financial manager. Just you and me until we know the scope. Agreed. Jiwon ended the call. He stood in the kitchen with the paper in his hand and the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where something has just fundamentally changed. Not the silence of peace, the silence of aftermath. He had built the Betrayal syndicate over 14 years. He had inherited a weakened organization and rebuilt it through discipline and strategic aggression, and the particular patience of a man who understood that power was accumulated slowly and lost quickly. He had made enemies and managed them. He had taken risks and survived them. He had believed, in the way that successful men in dangerous fields eventually believed, that he had developed a sufficient understanding of his own vulnerabilities. He had not understood this one, because this one had been built inside the walls. Amara found out about Jian on a Thursday morning. Elias called at 7:15, before she had finished her first coffee. "There's movement on the G1 side," he said. "They know about the KFIU filing." Amara set the coffee down. "How?" "Baek Sung-ho has contacts in document processing." Someone pulled a summary. "It's not exact. They may not have the full filing, but they have enough to understand the structure." "And Jian?" "Jian left Seoul 4 days ago. I've been tracking him. He's in Busan. He made contact with me last night." Amara was quiet for a moment. "What did he say?" "He said the timeline is accelerating and that G1 will move against the organization's internal structure within the week, which means anyone who might have been part of the filing chain is at risk. He wants to know if the protection arrangement still holds." The protection arrangement. This was something Amara had not shared with Soo-jin and had not shared with Min-jae, and had told Elias only because Elias was the one who had facilitated it. A year ago, 14 months, to be precise, Jian had come to Elias through an intermediary with an offer. He had been building a documented record of the Betrayal syndicate's financial irregularities for 2 years, intended originally as a personal insurance policy, and he was willing to transfer that record to a party who could use it appropriately in exchange for assistance relocating outside Korea when the time came. Elias had brought it to Amara. She had thought about it for 3 days. What Jian was offering was not something she'd sought. She had not gone looking for leverage against Ji-won's organization. She had gone looking for evidence of an affair, and the affair was what she found, and that was sufficient for the divorce. But Jian's material was not about the affair. It was about financial crimes. Real ones. The kind that regulatory agencies built cases around. She had made a decision that she had not made lightly and had not made without understanding what it meant. She had told Elias to tell Jian that if he filed a preservation record, with the KFIU not an active complaint, just a preservation, a document that existed and could be activated if needed, she would ensure his relocation assistance through channels that had no connection to her name. She had not told Jian what to include. She had not directed the filing. She had simply created the conditions under which a man who had already built the record decided to use it. The distinction mattered legally. Soo-jin would have said it mattered enormously. Amara had decided not to ask Soo-jin's opinion because she had known what the opinion would be and had made the decision anyway. Now it was in motion. "Tell Jian the arrangement holds," she said. "But he needs to stay out of Seoul. If Ji-won finds him before the KFIU moves from preliminary to active, the record disappears." He understands that. "How long before the KFIU moves?" "It's not predictable. It depends on whether someone inside the agency decides to prioritize it. The filing is solid. Jian built it over 2 years. It's documented correctly, but prioritization is political." Amara thought. "Is there someone who could move the timeline?" she said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "There's a senior investigator at the KFIU named Director Shin. She's been building a case against financial structures connected to organized crime for about 3 years. If Jian's filing lands on her desk rather than in the general queue, it moves faster." "Can we get it to her desk?" "That's a different conversation," Elias said carefully. "That's not preservation. That's direction." "I know what it is," Amara said. Another silence. "I need 24 hours to think about that," Elias said. "You have 12, she said. "Ji-won is going to move against his internal structure within the week. When he does, Jian's value as a source goes down significantly, because Ji-won will have already destroyed or moved whatever documentation still exists inside the organization. The KFIU window closes with Gion's access, Elias exhaled. 12 hours. Call me tonight. She ended the call. She sat with her coffee and looked at the river and thought about the distance between who she had been when she married Jiwon and who she was in this moment, sitting in a penthouse office, directing an investigator toward a regulatory authority to accelerate the downfall of a man who had called her weak. She was not entirely comfortable with all of it. She had learned, over the past 4 years, that discomfort was not the same as wrong. That you could do something genuinely necessary and still feel the weight of it, still wish the situation had been different, still carry the knowledge that clean choices were a luxury that circumstances did not always provide. One had called her predictable. She thought about that. Predictable meant he had built a model of her in his mind and trusted it. Predictable meant he had never updated the model when the evidence changed. Predictable meant he had looked at a woman who was quietly building something extraordinary and decided repeatedly that she was simply there, ambient, functional, not requiring attention. That model had cost him 8 years of understanding. And the cost was still accumulating. The meeting Ji-won had been dreading happened on a Friday. Not with Choi Choi's 10 days had been extended by 3, after Ji-won had made a payment from a personal account that was not connected to the Belrose routing structures. A payment that hurt and that he had made anyway, because Choi was not a man who tolerated grace periods. The meeting was with his 2 senior board members, Ryo and Nam, the 2 men who had been with the organization since before Ji-won's time, and who held, between them, enough institutional knowledge and informal influence to make his position unstable if they decided it should be. They met at Ryo's private office, which Ji-won noted as a signal. Neutral ground would have been a restaurant or a hotel meeting room. Ryo's office meant Ryo was establishing position before the conversation started. Nam was already there when Ji-won arrived, also a signal. They had talked before this. Ji-won sat down and waited. Ryo was 71, thin-faced, with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that speed was for people who didn't understand power. He poured 3 glasses of whiskey that no one had asked for and placed them on the table with the careful precision of a ritual. The KFIU filing, Ryo said. Ji-won said nothing. We know about it, Nam said. Nam was 64, heavier than Ryo, with a directness that had always made him easier to read, and therefore, paradoxically, harder to outmaneuver. We've known for 2 days. We wanted to understand it before we came to you. And do you? Ji-won said. Understand it? We understand that it exists, Ryo said. We understand that it involves financial transactions structured by Jion, who is no longer reachable. We understand that the preservation record was filed 6 weeks ago, which means someone was sitting on this information while the divorce proceedings were ongoing and chose not to use it then. He picked up his whiskey and held it without drinking. We want to know what the connection is. Ji-won looked at him. Between the filing and the divorce, Ryo said, in case Ji-won had not understood the direction of the question. Ji-won thought about Amara at the divorce table, the absolute stillness of her, the pen moving across the paper without hesitation. She had known, sitting at that table, that this was already filed. She had known and said nothing, and signed and walked out. My ex-wife hired an investigator, Ji-won said. The investigator found transactions in the course of tracking my financial movements for the divorce proceedings. He filed the record. He kept his voice level. The connection is the investigator, not my ex-wife. Ryo and Nam looked at each other. That look lasted approximately 1 second, but Ji-won had been reading rooms for 20 years, and 1 second was enough. They didn't believe him. Not entirely. They believed the facts as he had stated them, probably. But they had drawn a conclusion from the sequence of events, and the conclusion was the same one Ji-won had been sitting with for 2 days, that the filing was not incidental, that it was structured, that it was a contingency built into a larger architecture by someone who had been thinking several moves ahead. Jion built the transactions, Nam said, not an outside investigator. Jion built something that was specifically designed to be found. I know, Ji-won said, which means Jion was working toward this outcome. Yes. For how long? Ji-won picked up his whiskey. That's what I'm trying to determine. Ryo set his own glass down. G1. We need to be honest with each other. If the KFIU filing becomes an active case, the organization's exposure is significant. Not catastrophic, the transactions are one set among many, and our legal structures are sound in most other areas, but significant enough that we need to control the narrative before the agency moves. I agree. To control the narrative, we need to understand who built it, Nam said. All of it, not just Jian. The full chain. Who knew, who directed, who stood to benefit. The question was not neutral. Jiwan understood that the question contained, beneath its surface, a specific accusation that neither Ryo nor Nam was willing to state directly yet, that the person who stood to benefit from the KFIU filing was the person who had just divorced Jiwan and walked away from the organization's financial structures, and that if her investigator had filed the record, the question of her involvement was not academic. If Amara was connected to the filing, she had done something more significant than build a company in secret. She had spent years embedded in the organization's financial operations while simultaneously building a case that could be triggered at the right moment. That was not divorce strategy. That was something else. Give me the week, Jiwan said. I'll find Jian. When I have Jian, we'll know the chain. Ryo looked at him for a long moment. You have until Wednesday, he said. Then we convene again, with or without answers. Jiwan nodded once and stood. He shook both their hands, the particular handshake of men who were not enemies yet and were measuring the distance carefully. He rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby, he stopped. He stood in the middle of the marble floor and thought about Amara Belrose, who had sat across from him at a divorce table with her hands still and her eyes clear, and who had signed papers that ended a marriage and triggered a financial collapse and walked out into a car that was waiting, and who had known all of it, while he knew none of it. She had not done this out of revenge. He was certain of that, and the certainty was the worst part of it, because if it was revenge, he could understand it, could locate himself in the story as someone who had been wronged and was being punished, which was a familiar narrative with a familiar shape. But Amara had not built this to punish him. She had built this to survive him. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a wound and a wall. And Jiwan was standing outside the wall, looking at the height of it, understanding for the first time how long it had taken to build, and how completely it had been built, and how thoroughly he was on the wrong side of it. His phone buzzed. Bake found something on Jian. Call me. Jiwan walked out of the building into the cold air and called. Bake answered immediately. Jian met with someone in Busan 2 days ago. We have a photo from a contact in the area. Jiwan paused that had weight in it. The person he met with is Elias Park. Jiwan stopped walking. Amara's investigator, he said. Yes. The street was busy lunch hour, pedestrians moving past him in both directions, the city indifferent and continuous. So Jian went to Busan to meet with Amara's investigator. Jiwan said slowly, after leaving Seoul, after I started looking for him. Yes, which means Jian knew I would start looking. And he went to someone connected to Amara. That's what it looks like. Jiwan stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and understood with the complete and devastating clarity that comes only after you have exhausted every other interpretation that Jian had not been working alone, that the KFIU filing was not a coincidence or an opportunistic move by an outside investigator, that the architecture of what had just happened to him was something that had been built with patience and intelligence, and the kind of long-range planning that required someone who understood the organization from the inside and someone who understood the law from the outside. And those two people had found each other. They had been building this together for a long time. And the person who had created the conditions, the person who had seen the gap between Jian's knowledge and the organization's exposure and understood how to connect them, was the woman who had sat across from him at a divorce table 11 days ago and signed her name without hesitation and walked out to a car that was waiting. Jiwan, Bake said. What do you want to do? The traffic moved. The city moved. The river was somewhere behind the buildings, invisible but present. The way certain things were always present. Jiwan thought about Rio's office, the whiskey on the table, the look that had passed between the two old men in the space of 1 second. He thought about Choi in the parking structure. 10 days. He thought about Yuna walking out of the restaurant without looking back. He thought about the paper on the kitchen floor and the particular cold of the tile against his legs. Splitsing. He thought about everything he had built over 14 years, and what was happening to the foundation of it, and how long it would take for the structure above the foundation to show the damage. Not long at all. Call Ryo, he said. His voice was flat and very quiet. Tell him I need another meeting. Tonight. What are you going to tell him? Ji-won looked at the street. The truth, he said. Everything I know. Because if I walk into Wednesday without giving them something real, they're going to make a decision about the organization's leadership that doesn't include me, and then I lose everything I have left to lose. A silence on the line, and Amara, Baek said. Ji-won closed his eyes for 1 second. He thought about a woman at a kitchen table with a laptop, and 3 folders, and himself walking to the refrigerator, and the words she had said consulting work and how he had accepted it and moved on, and all the years that had moved in that same direction. All the moments he had chosen not to look, because looking required asking, and asking required the admission that he didn't already know. He opened his eyes. The street was still there. The city was still there. Leave her alone, he said. Baek was quiet. She built a wall. Baek. You don't fight a wall. You find out what's on the other side of it, and you decide if you can live with that or not. His voice did not waver. We have bigger problems than Amara Belrose right now. He hung up. He stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then he turned and walked, and the city moved around him, and the ground beneath everything he had spent 14 years, building was shifting in ways he could feel but not yet see, and somewhere across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking the Han River, a woman he had spent 7 years underestimating was already 3 moves ahead of wherever he thought he was going. The meeting with Ryo happened at 9 that night. Not at Ryo's office this time. At a private residence in Songbukdong that Ryo had owned for 30 years, and that did not appear in any public record connected to his name. The kind of house that existed outside the normal documentation of a man's life, a house for conversations that needed to disappear after they happened. Ji-won had been here twice before, both times under circumstances that required the specific privacy of a place with no cameras and no staff who would remember anything. Nam was there, and a third man Ji-won had not expected, Park Do-sik, the bakery organization's oldest surviving founding member, 78 years old, who had retired from active involvement 7 years ago, and whose presence tonight meant that whatever was being decided had already been decided at a level above Ji-won's knowledge. That was the first thing Ji-won understood when he walked into the room. He was not here to give information. He was here to be evaluated. Ryo poured nothing this time. No whiskey, no ritual. Just 4 men in chairs, in a room with the curtains drawn and the particular atmosphere of where something was going to be said that could not be unsaid. Park Do-sik spoke first, which told Ji-won everything about the evening's architecture. We've been watching the situation for 2 weeks, Park said. His voice was thin but precise, the voice of a man who had outlasted many things by being careful about what he said and when. Not just the financial situation, the whole situation. The divorce, the filing, what you didn't know about your own house. Ji-won said nothing. We're not here to punish you, Park said. We're here because the organization has survived 31 years by being honest about its vulnerabilities before those vulnerabilities became crises. Right now, you are a vulnerability. I understand that, Ji-won said. Do you? Park looked at him steadily. Because understanding it and being willing to do what's required by that understanding are 2 different things. What's required? Ji-won said. Ryo and Nam exchanged nothing. No look, no signal, which meant they had already resolved whatever disagreement had existed between them before Ji-won arrived. Temporary restructuring, Ryo said. Operational leadership transfers to Baek for 90 days, while the KFIU situation is managed. You remain on the board. Your equity position is unchanged. But decisions, internal decisions, external-facing decisions, everything go through Baek until the filing is resolved. Ji-won looked at him. You're removing me, he said. We're protecting the organization, Nam said. which includes protecting you. If the KFIU moves from preliminary to active while you're in the operational seat, everything you've built for 14 years becomes evidence in a case you cannot control. This way there's distance. 90 days, G1 said. Minimum, Park said. If the situation resolves cleanly, you return to full operational authority. If it doesn't, he left the sentence incomplete, which was its own kind of precision. G1 sat with it. He had spent 14 years building the Betrayal organization from a weakened, underfunded operation that two other syndicates had been in the process of absorbing when he took control into something that commanded genuine respect in Seoul's underground economy. He had done it through discipline and strategic intelligence and the willingness to make decisions that other men couldn't make. He had understood going in that the position required everything: his time, his judgment, his reputation, his marriage, as it turned out. And now 3 men in a room in Songbukdong were telling him to step back. Not because he had made a mistake. Because a woman he had spent 7 years underestimating had built something so comprehensive and so carefully structured that its mere existence was enough to destabilize everything he'd built without her doing anything aggressive at all. She had simply built a wall, and he had walked into it. Bake knows the operations, G1 said. His voice was even. He can handle 90 days. Yes, Rio said. I want the KFIU situation on my desk daily. Every development. That's reasonable, Nam said. And I want to be the one who talks to Choi. He doesn't know Bake well enough to trust a transition without explanation. Ryo looked at Park. Park nodded once. Small, agreed, Ryo said. Ji-won stood. He shook Park's hand first. The old man's grip was still firm, the grip of someone who had held things for a long time and had not forgotten how. Then Rio. Then Nam. He walked out of the house into the Songbukdong night. The air was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that came off the hills behind this neighborhood, and Ji-won stood on the narrow street for a moment and breathed it in and let the sound of the house, the warm, contained sound of men deciding things, disappear behind the closed door. He had just been removed from the organization he built. Temporarily, technically, with all the appropriate language of preservation and protection. But removed. He got into his car and sat in the dark and thought about what came next. And what came next was not the organization. Because the organization would survive without him, it had survived things worse than this. And Bake was competent, and the 90 days would either resolve or it wouldn't. What came next was something more specific. What came next was understanding the full shape of what Amara had built. Not to fight it, not to dismantle it, to understand it. Splitting. Because you could not make decisions about your future if you didn't understand the architecture of the thing that had changed it. Amara received Elias's call at 11 that night. She was still at the office. She had been there since 7 that morning, which was becoming a pattern she recognized as both productive and slightly unsustainable, the pattern of someone running on purpose rather than schedule. She had the Singapore partnership document spread across the conference table and was making final notations in the margins when the phone rang. Director Shin took the file, Elias said. Amara set her pen down. When this afternoon, it moved from the general queue to her active desk. She's already requested supplementary documentation from the original filing. That's fast. She's been waiting for something like this. The transactions Jian documented connect to 2 other cases she's been building independently. She recognized the pattern within hours. Elias paused. Amara, when Shin's investigation goes active, it won't stay quiet. There are going to be questions about the filing chain. About Jian. About who knew what and when, I know. If anyone draws a line from the filing to Jian to Elias Park to Belrose Meridian Holdings, that line doesn't exist in any document, Amara said. Our arrangement with Jian was verbal. The relocation assistance went through channels that aren't connected to my name. Verbal arrangements and clean channels are good, Elias said. They're not perfect. Nothing is perfect. She picked up the pen again. What's Jian's status? He's moving. Left Busan this morning. He'll be out of the country by the weekend. Good. She looked at the river through the window. Black water, bridge lights, the slow pulse of the city at night. And Jiwon? Quiet today. which is unusual enough that I'm watching it closely. He had a meeting in Songbukdong tonight. A pause. How do you know that? Because that's where Rio lives, Amara said. And when an organization's senior board convenes at a private residence at night, it means the situation has moved from a management problem to a leadership problem. She turned away from the window. Jiwon has been restructured. Temporarily, probably. But he's out of the operational seat. You're certain? Reasonably. She gathered the Singapore documents into order. Watch the Baekryu operational channels tomorrow morning. If Baek Sung-ho starts making decisions that were previously Jiwon's approvals, communications, anything that confirms it. And if it's confirmed, then the KFIU case proceeds without Jiwon being able to respond from a position of operational authority, which means the organization's capacity to manage the exposure is reduced significantly. She clicked her pen closed, which is where we need it to be. She ended the call. She sat in the quiet office for a moment, and the moment was not comfortable. She had stopped pretending to herself. That comfort was available at this stage of things, that you could build something of this scope and sit with it pleasantly. You built it because it was necessary. You carried it because you had chosen to. And the weight of it was part of the choice. She thought about Sujin's warning. There will be a moment when it's personal, even though you've decided it isn't. She thought about whether that moment had arrived. She decided it had not. Not yet. She picked up the Singapore documents and kept working. Wednesday came with rain, the kind of soul rain that came in sideways off the river and found every gap in every coat and made the city look like it was being rinsed of something. Jiwon drove himself to the KFIU's public liaison office, not the main investigative building. The public-facing office near City Hall where citizens could make inquiries about regulatory proceedings, and sat in the parking structure for 11 minutes before going inside. He was not there officially. He had no attorney with him, no appointment. He had come because he needed to see the shape of the thing directly, rather than through Baek's reports or his financial manager's careful language. The public liaison officer was a young man named Song, who had the particular combination of efficiency and minimal effect that government work sometimes produced, and who looked at Jiwon's identification and found the name in the system, and then looked at Jiwon with an expression that was carefully neutral. The filing is in an active review status, Song said. I can confirm that. I can't provide any additional information about the scope or timeline of the review. Who is the lead investigator? Jiwon said. I can't provide that information at this stage of proceedings. Is there a hearing scheduled? Any formal proceedings would be communicated to the relevant parties through official channels. Song looked at him with the paints of someone who had said these sentences many times. Is there anything else I can help you with? Jiwon looked at the young man behind the desk. He thought about 14 years. He thought about the particular texture of power, how it felt to walk into rooms and have things happen because you walked in, how it felt to make calls that produced results, how that feeling had become so ambient that he had stopped noticing it, the way you stopped noticing the air. He was noticing it now, in its absence, sitting in a public liaison office across from a government employee, who was looking at him with professional neutrality and no fear. No, Jiwon said, thank you. He walked back to the parking structure. In the car, rain against the roof, he called Sujin Han's office. Not for himself, Sujin was Amara's attorney. He knew that. He called because he needed to say something to someone connected to this situation who would pass it on, and Sujin was the most direct channel. Her assistant answered. Tell her I need 5 minutes, Jiwon said. Just 5. No attorneys, no agendas. I need to say something. The assistant put him on hold for 90 seconds. Then Sujin's voice, flat and precise, Mr. Kang, I'm not calling to negotiate, he said immediately. I'm not calling about the settlement or the filing or any of the legal proceedings. I need you to give Amara a message. A pause. I'm listening. Tell her. He stopped. He looked at the rain on the windshield. He had thought about this for 3 days, about what the message should be, and had rewritten it many times in his head, and every version felt either too much or not enough. Tell her I understand now. What she built, what she managed. What she did for the organization without anyone asking her to, and without anyone noticing. Tell her I understand it, and I'm not going to come at her for it. Silence on the line. That's it, Sujin said. That's it. Another pause. I'll pass it on. He ended the call. The rain kept coming. Sujin called Amara from her car 20 minutes later. Amara was at the Jeju registration office. She had arrived. When it opened, as planned, and the amendment had been filed correctly, and she was now standing on the sidewalk outside in the rain with an umbrella and a completed checklist and the specific quiet satisfaction of something done properly under pressure. She listened to Sujin relay the message. She said nothing for a moment. He said he understands what I built, she said, and that he won't come at you for it. Amara looked at the rain on the street. A taxi moved through a puddle and sent water across the curb. He's been restructured, she said. He's out of the operational seat. That would explain the call, Sujin said. A man who still had operational authority wouldn't need to make that call. He'd make a different kind of move. Yes. Amara closed the umbrella. The rain had lightened to something that barely registered. Don't respond to it. Don't acknowledge it. It's not a negotiation, so there's nothing to negotiate. Just file it, filed Sujin said dryly. Amara hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in the lightning rain and thought about Jiwon in a car somewhere, making a call he didn't have to make, saying something he didn't have to say, and what it meant that he had said it anyway. She decided it meant he was human after all. She had known that somewhere. Known it the way you know things about people you've lived with for 7 years, even when the knowing is buried under all the other things, the disappointment, the betrayal, the long accumulation of not being seen. You knew the human parts. You just stopped relying on them. She turned and walked to her car. She had a board meeting at 2. The KFIU's investigation went active and formal on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Jiwon's filing landed on Director Shin's desk. Jiwon found out through Beck, who found out through a legal contact, who found out 40 minutes after the formal status change was logged in the agency's system. The call came at 8:20 a.m. While Jiwon was at the apartment drinking coffee and reading through the operational reports. Beck sent each morning reading them carefully. The way you read things when you're no longer the person making the decisions and you're trying to stay connected to something that is moving without you. It's formal, Beck said. Director Shin issued the investigative order this morning. They're requesting documentation from 3 financial institutions and from 2 individuals named in Jiwon's filing. Which individuals? Jiwon himself. A pause. A former financial manager named Lee, who had left the organization 4 years ago. Not Jiwon's name, not yet. But the documentation requests from the financial institutions would pull transaction records that contained Jiwon's authorizations, and authorization records were the kind of thing that investigative teams built timelines around. How long before they come to me directly? Jiwon said. Our attorney says minimum 6 weeks, possibly 4 months. It depends on what the documentation produces. And the organization's exposure? Ryo has engaged a senior financial crimes attorney. The strategy is to separate the specific transactions Jiwon flagged from the broader operational structure. Argue they were anomalous, not systemic. Is that argument credible? A brief silence. It's defensible, Beck said, which was the careful language of someone who thought the answer was no but could not say it directly. Jiwon set the coffee down. Who's advising Ryo on the strategy? A firm called Cho & Associates. Jiwon knew the firm. He had used them once years ago for a contract dispute. They were good, expensive, and precise, and deeply connected to the regulatory environment. If Ryo had engaged Cho & Associates, the organization was taking the threat seriously enough to invest in its defense, which was both reassuring and sobering. Keep me updated, Jiwon said. Daily, Beck said. As agreed, Jiwon ended the call. He sat in the apartment with the operational reports and the cold coffee and the particular quiet of a Thursday morning when the city was already in motion and he was sitting still. The investigation was formal. Everything he had spent 14 years building was now inside a regulatory process that moved according to its own schedule and responded to its own logic, and his ability to influence that process was approximately 0. And the distance between that reality and the reality he had lived in for 14 years, where his ability to influence things was essentially total. was so vast that he could not quite hold it as a single thought. He picked up the coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The board meeting Amara chaired at 2 o'clock on the same Thursday was the largest she had conducted since founding Bell Rose Meridian Holdings. 12 people around the table, 4 of her original investors, 3 new institutional partners brought in through the Singapore arrangement, Grace Lim from the private equity fund, Minjai's representative, Sujin in her capacity as general counsel, Dae Young managing documentation at the end of the table, and Amara at the head. She had not slept well the previous night. She knew it and had accounted for it an extra 20 minutes on her preparation, a deliberately simple outfit, so she wasn't making decisions about presentation under fatigue, 2 cups of coffee before the meeting instead of 1. She opened with the Jeju registration. Completed Wednesday morning, she said. The amendment resolves the jurisdiction question, and the structure is now fully registered and protected. The international transfer mechanism is clean. Grace Lim made a note. Hongdae timeline. One of the institutional partners said, a man named Director Wu, 50-ish, with the evaluating expression of someone who had heard projection and funded some of them and regretted a portion of that. On schedule, Amara said. We accelerated contractor onboarding by 2 weeks. The milestone payment structure is creating the pressure we wanted on the build schedule. First phase completion is still projected at 18 months from groundbreaking. What's the contingency if the build runs over? Said. 3 weeks of float built into the contractor agreements before penalties activate. The penalty structure then incentivizes the contractor to recover schedule rather than abandon it. We've also pre-qualified 2 backup contractors at the structural phase in case of a primary default. Wu looked at the table and then back at her. You anticipated a default scenario. I anticipated a range of scenarios, Amara said. That's one of them. She heard Minjae's representative, a precise woman named Ha Yun, who had worked with Minjae for 6 years and who Amara had come to trust as a proxy for Minjae's actual opinion, make a small sound that might have been approval. The meeting ran 3 hours. 3 hours of numbers and projections and contingencies, and the specific language of people building something together with real money and real risk. And Amara moved through all of it with the focus that had been available to her on the best days. For 4 years, the focus that came from knowing exactly what you were building and why, from having a clear sightline to the thing you were working toward. When the meeting ended, Wu stopped her in the corridor. Bell rose. He was blunt in the way of men who had been in rooms like this for 20 years and had stopped bothering with preamble. I looked at your full portfolio before today, not just the summary materials. I know, Amara said. Your office requested the detailed files last week. He looked at her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about it for a moment, which she respected. He was a man who answered questions he'd actually considered rather than questions he'd heard. Someone who had gotten lucky once and was writing it. The Mapo Gu project was so clean, it looked like a template rather than a first attempt. I thought there had to be something I was missing. And now I think there isn't. He nodded once, the nod of someone making a private notation. The Hongdae project has my full participation. He walked to the elevator. Amara watched him go. She turned back toward her office. In the corridor, Dae-young was already waiting with the afternoon's messages, 2 calls to return. A contract amendment that needed her signature, and a message from Elias that she read standing up, right there in the hallway. Jian is out of the country. Clean exit. No traceable connection to BM Holdings. KFIU proceeding independently on the filed documentation. She folded the paper, handed it back to Dae-young, who would shred it. She went into her office. She sat at her desk. For a moment, she did not open anything or call anyone, or reach for the next item in the sequence. She sat and looked at the Han River through the window. The afternoon light on it, gray-gold the way it got in late November, the colors of something settling. She thought about her grandmother, Celeste. She did not think about her often. In these moments, the business moments, the moments of forward motion. Celeste lived more in the quiet parts of her thinking, in the early mornings and the late nights, in the spaces between decisions. But sometimes she surfaced in the middle of things, and when she did, it was always specific, Not general warmth or generalized memory, but a precise image or phrase. Today it was the kitchen table in Atlanta, the smell of her grandmother's coffee, the way Celeste had looked at her in the final hours, not at Amara's hands or Amara's face but directly into her, the way very old people sometimes looked at you when they had stopped having the time for the surface of things. Power revealed people's true intentions. That was what Celeste had said. She had been warning Amara about Ji-won. But she had been teaching her about something larger, too, about what happened when you put money and authority in front of people, what it stripped away, what it left visible. About the importance of understanding what you were looking at before you committed to it. Amara had taken 7 years to fully understand the lesson. She understood it now. She opened the afternoon's first file. The confrontation happened on a Friday evening. Not planned, not structured. The kind of confrontation that happens because circumstances produce it, and two people are both in the same place and neither of them has a reason to leave. Ji-won came to the Hannum office building. He had not called ahead. He had not coordinated with anyone. He had driven across the city in the early evening with the traffic thickening around him and pulled into the building's underground parking and ridden the elevator to the 28th floor and told the receptionist his name. The receptionist called Dae-young. Dae-young came to the reception area and looked at Ji-won with an expression of professional assessment that contained no particular feeling. Ms. Belrose is available for 15 minutes, Dae-young said, which meant Amara had decided to see him. Ji-won followed Dae-young down the corridor. The office was large and clean, oriented toward the river. Amara was standing. When he came in, not at her desk but at the window, which he understood as a choice, she was not going to receive him from behind the desk like a formal meeting, and she was not going to sit like a conversation between equals. She was standing at the window of her own office in her own building, and he was going to come to her. Dae-young closed the door. They were alone. Ji-won had thought about what he would say. He had, as it turned out, been thinking about it for 3 weeks, turning it over in the particular way that problems turned over in the mind when they contained both practical and personal dimensions, and the two dimensions kept interfering with each other. He had decided on honesty, not because it was strategic, because he was tired of strategy, at least in relation to this specific person. I needed to see the actual size of it, he said. Amara looked at him. She was in work clothes, dark trousers, a structured navy jacket, and she looked the way she always looked when she was in the middle of something which was focused and slightly contained, like a person who was allowing a portion of their attention to this situation, while the rest remained operational. It's bigger than I expected, he said. He looked around the office, the scale of it, the quality of it, the view. All of it. Is that why you came? Amara said. To see the size of it? Partly. He moved to the center of the room but did not approach the window. He stopped at a reasonable distance. I also came because I said something through your attorney and I wanted to say it directly. I understand what you built. Not just the company. The whole architecture. What you did with the organization's finances. What you set in motion. He looked at her steadily. I understand it, and I'm not going to fight it. You couldn't fight it, Amara said. I know that. There was no heat in his voice. I'm not saying it as a strategy. I'm saying it because it's true and because I've spent 3 weeks being honest with myself about things I wasn't honest about before, and this is part of that. Amara looked at him for a moment. She turned back to the window. What do you want, Ji-won? He was quiet for a moment. Nothing, he said. I don't want anything from you. I came because he stopped. He started again. You sat in that courthouse and you knew all of it. You knew the filing existed. You knew the routing structures were going to collapse. You knew Jian was already out, and you sat there and signed your name and looked at me like I was someone you'd already said goodbye to a long time ago. The river was dark at this hour. The bridge lights came on one by one as the evening deepened. Because I had, Amara said quietly. I know, his voice was flat and honest. I know you had. I'm not here to relitigate anything. I just needed you to know that I see it now, the whole picture. What I had and what I did with it, and what it cost. She said nothing. The woman you are, he said, was there the entire time. I didn't look. The office was very quiet. Amara kept her eyes on the river. "You should go," she said. "I have work." He nodded. He crossed the office toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the door handle. "The foundation," he said. "I read about it. Your grandmother's name." He paused. He stopped himself before the sentence finished. Because it was too much, because he had not earned it, because some things did not belong to him. He opened the door. He walked out. In the corridor, Dae-young was waiting, not obviously, not intrusively, but present, the way competent people were present when something required management. She walked Ji-won to the elevator without speaking. The elevator doors opened. Ji-won stepped in, turned around. The corridor was clean and lit, and entirely, completely hers. The doors closed. Amara stood at the window for a long time after he left. She heard the elevator doors in the distance. She heard the building settling. The quiet movement of air through the ventilation, the faint pulse of the city through the glass. She thought about what he'd said, what I had and what I did with it and what it cost. She thought about 7 years, the apartment in Mapo-gu, the kitchen table and the laptop and the folders, the second phone she had kept because she needed a separate line for the business calls she was making and could not explain. Quarterly transfers she had run through his accounts, not because she owed him that protection, but because she was the kind of woman who did the thing that needed doing even when no one was asking. A sound like green smoke. She thought about the moment 3 years into the marriage, maybe 2.5 when she had understood with quiet certainty that he would not grow toward her, that the distance between who he was and who she had hoped he was becoming was not going to close. She had made a decision in that moment, without drama, without announcement. She would build her own life within the structure of this one, and she would be ready when the structure ended. That decision had taken everything she had, not just the money, the discipline, the patience, the years of being still while he moved, of being quiet while he talked, of being present in a room with him, while her real attention was somewhere else entirely. She had not been proud of all of it. There were parts of the architecture Jian, the filing, the conditions she had created, that she carried with a specific weight, the weight of choices made cleanly, but not cleanly enough to sit with easily. She did not regret them, but she carried them. The river was dark. The bridge lights were fully on. She turned from the window and went back to her desk and opened the file she had been working on before Ji-won arrived. The foundation documents, the program structure, the educational grants framework that Soo-jin's team had been drafting for 6 weeks. The Celeste Belrose Foundation. Her grandmother's name on something that would outlast all of this, the marriage, the divorce, the KFIU investigation, the syndicate's restructuring, all of it. Something that would exist when the other things were settled and done. She read the framework. She made 3 notations in the margins. She picked up her phone and called Min-jae. He answered on the second ring. Background noise. He was somewhere public, a restaurant or a function. "Are you in the middle of something?" she said. "I'm leaving in 5 minutes," he said. "What do you need?" "Nothing urgent. I want to talk about the foundation program structure when you have time." "Tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock. "Your office or mine?" "Mine," she said. 8 o'clock, he repeated. She heard something in his voice, not the words, but the register of them, the particular ease of a man who was glad she had called, who would have been glad whenever she called, who was not managing her or performing comfort at her, but simply present. She had not had that before. She was learning the shape of it. 8 o'clock, she said. "Good night, Min-jae." She ended the call. She sat in her office with the foundation documents and the river outside, and the particular quality of an evening that had contained more than she had planned for and had not broken her. She read until 9. Then she closed everything, turned off the desk lamp, and stood at the window one last time. Seoul at night was its own kind of beautiful, not clean or uncomplicated, but alive in a way that required something from you, asked you to be equal to it. She had built herself equal to it. She picked up her coat. She walked out. And in the 11th floor of a government building 8 blocks away, Director Shin of the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit was working late too, reading through a 14-page supplementary document that Jian had provided as part of his filing, a document that named specific authorization signatures on specific transactions and she was circling names with a red pen, and the list of circles was growing. And the case she had been building for 3 years was about to become the biggest regulatory action of her career. And neither she nor Amara nor Jiwon could fully see yet what the morning would bring. Director Shin worked through the night. This was not unusual for her. She had worked through many nights in the 3 years. She had been building cases against financial structures connected to organized crime in Seoul. A sound like green wood splitting, and she had learned that the nights were where the real work happened. Not because the evidence was different at midnight than at noon, but because the silence removed everything that was not the work, and what was left was just her and the documents and the slow accumulation of understanding. By 2 in the morning, she had circled 11 names. By 4, she had a timeline that ran across 14 months and connected 3 financial institutions, 2 shell company structures, and 1 man whose meticulous record-keeping had, ironically, made the entire architecture visible, Jian, who had built the thing so carefully that the careful building itself was the evidence. By 6, when the first gray light came through the office window, and the city started its morning noise below, Shin put her pen down and looked at what she had assembled. It was enough. Not for a conviction. Conviction was a long road, lawyers and motions, and the grinding institutional process that took years. But it was enough for a formal action. Enough to move from investigation to enforcement. Enough to put names on documents that would be served by the end of the business week. She picked up her phone and called her deputy. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough with sleep. "Come in early," she said. "We're moving." Amara found out at 7:48 a.m., 8 minutes before her meeting with Min Jae, when Elias called. She was in her office. The coffee was fresh. The foundation documents were on the desk where she had left them the night before, her margin notations still visible in the morning light. Shin issued enforcement notices this morning, Elias said. 3 financial institutions received documentation preservation orders. 2 individuals received formal notification of investigative status. Jiwon, not yet. The notices went to the institutions and to Jian's former associate Lee. But the authorization signatures in Jian's supplementary document are Jiwon's. When they pull the institutional records, his authorizations will be in them. How long before his name is on a notice? Shin moves fast when she moves. 72 hours. Maybe less. Amara looked at the river. Morning light on it, thin, pale. The particular quality of early winter sun that gave everything a temporary brightness before settling into the day's gray. And the organization's response? Cho and Associates filed a preliminary motion to challenge the preservation orders this morning. Ryo's team is moving fast. Elias paused. They're good attorneys, Amara. This won't be simple. I know it won't be simple, she said. It was never going to be simple. A silence on the line. Is there anything you need from me at this stage? Elias said. She thought about the question. She had thought about it, in various forms, for months what the end of this looked like, what her role in it was, what she would need to be when the thing she had set in motion reached its final velocity. She had wanted accountability, not destruction. She had been honest with herself about that distinction, had examined it many times to make sure it was real and not just a comfortable framing. She had wanted the financial crimes documented and visible because they were real crimes that had real victims, not because Jiwon had hurt her. Those 2 things could be true at the same time. She had learned that. Nothing, she said. You've done everything you needed to do. This is Shin's process now. Understood, a brief pause. For what it's worth, you built something real, Amara. The company, the foundation, all of it. Whatever happens with the investigation, that exists independently. I know, she said. She ended the call. A knock at the door. Min Jae came in with his own coffee and a folder, and he stopped when he saw her face, not because she was visibly distressed. A sound like green wood splitting, but because he had been paying attention to her face for 11 months, and he could read the difference between her working focus and her carrying something focus. What happened? He said. Shin moved, she said. Enforcement notices went out this morning. He set his folder on the table. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table, not asserting anything, just present. The way he was present, which she had come to understand, was a specific and deliberate kind of attention. How do you feel? He said. It was a direct question. He asked direct questions without apology, which she had found disconcerting at first and had come to find necessary. Like, I've been holding something very heavy for a long time, she said, and I've put it down, and my arms still remember the weight. He looked at her. That's honest, he said. I'm trying to be. The foundation documents, he said, nodding toward the papers on her desk. Can we start with those? I think that's where your attention should be today. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. Let's start there. Jiwon received the formal notification on a Friday morning. Not at the apartment was already in transition. He had begun the process of moving out because staying in a space that belonged to a life that no longer existed was a particular form of punishment he had decided not to inflict on himself. He received it at the office of Cho and Associates, where he had come for a strategy meeting, and where the notification arrived by courier while he was sitting across from the senior partner, a woman named attorney Cho Young-hee, who had the contained, evaluating manner of someone who had seen many situations and categorized this one before she fully knew it. The courier handed the envelope to Cho's assistant. The assistant brought it in. Jiwon opened it. He read it. He set it on the table. Cho Young-hee looked at it, then at him. May I? He pushed it toward her. She read it quickly, with the speed of someone who knew what she was looking for. When she put it down, her expression had not changed, which was either reassuring or alarming, depending on your perspective. This is a formal notification of investigative status, she said. Not a charge, not an indictment. They're telling you you're under investigation, which they're required to do at this stage. I know what it is, Jiwon said. It means Director Shin has enough to move, but not enough yet to prosecute. There's a gap between this and a formal charge, and our job is to make that gap as wide and as durable as possible. How wide can it get? Cho Young-hee looked at the notification. The transactions Jion documented are specific. The authorization signatures are yours. We can't make those facts disappear. She looked at him directly. What we can do is contextualize them. Argue that the transactions were consistent with legitimate business operations at the time, that the financial structures were designed by advisors operating independently of your direct knowledge, that you acted in good faith on advice given by a trusted financial manager who has since, as you know, vacated his position. Put it on, Jiwon said, not put it on him. Contextualize his role. He built the structures. He managed the routing. He made specific architectural decisions that created the exposure. Those are facts. Jiwon looked at the notification on the table. He thought about Jion, 60 years old, fastidious dresser. The man who had built a record over 2 years and then handed it to the right person at the right moment and walked out of the country clean. He felt something about that, not exactly anger, because anger required a kind of energy he did not currently have access to, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of being outmaneuvered by someone you trusted so completely you had never once looked at what they were actually doing. He understood in Jion's position why it had been done. Jion had built his own insurance policy. The way people who understood dangerous organizations built insurance policies carefully, quietly, without announcement, using the knowledge the organization itself had given him. And when the moment came, when the conditions were right, he had activated it. Jiwon had done something similar once, early in his career. He had built a record against a man he worked under, had kept it filed away for 3 years, and had used it when the time came. He had been 27, and the strategy had felt entirely rational. He could not, in good conscience, hold Jion in contempt for it. Build the contextualization, he said to Cho Young-hee. Do what you need to do, but I want to understand one thing clearly. He met her eyes. What's the realistic outcome range? She was quiet for a moment. Best case, she said, the investigation produces insufficient evidence for prosecution and closes within 12 to 18 months. Your name remains on the investigative record, but no formal charges are filed. She paused. Worst case, the institutional records produce documentation that supports a financial crimes charge, in which case we negotiate the most favorable resolution available, which, given the nature of the transactions, would likely involve significant financial penalties and potentially a period of operational restriction. Prison, Ji-won said. Unlikely at this stage, she said carefully. The transactions as documented are financial crimes rather than violent crimes. The regulatory framework tends toward financial remediation rather than incarceration for first-time white-collar cases of this type. Unlikely, he repeated. Nothing is certain until it's resolved, she said. That's the honest answer. He picked up the notification and folded it along its original crease. Build the defense, he said. I'll provide whatever documentation you need. He stood. Cho Young-hee stood with him. Mr. Kang, she said. He stopped. I've handled a significant number of regulatory cases. The ones that resolve most favorably are the ones where the client is consistent, cooperative with their own legal team, and does not attempt to influence the process externally. She looked at him evenly. Whatever other resources you have available to, you use them on your business going forward. Not on this. He understood what she was saying. Understood, he said. He walked out. In the weeks that followed, a strange stillness settled over the situation. Not the stillness of resolution. Everything was still very much in motion, the investigation proceeding on Shin's timeline, the organization's defense proceeding on Cho's, the Baekryu syndicate operating under Baek's careful interim management, the financial structures rebuilding slowly around the gaps Amara's departure had left. Everything was moving, but the acute phase was over. The thing had peaked and was now descending into the long institutional process that would determine its shape, and there was nothing Ji-won could do about the pace of that descent except be ready for whatever it produced. He had never been good at waiting. He had spent his adult life in motion decisions, consequences, responses, the constant forward pressure of managing an organization that rewarded action and punished hesitation. Waiting was not a skill he had developed because he had never needed it. He was developing it now. He monked out of the Mapogu apartment and into a smaller place in Yongsan, a 2-bedroom apartment on the 14th floor with a direct view of the river, which he had not intended as symbolic, and which became symbolic anyway, because that was how things worked. He unpacked carefully, which was something he had never done before, because moving in his adult life had always been managed by other people. He did it himself this time because he needed to understand the physical dimensions of what he was left with. It was not nothing. It was smaller than what he'd had. More limited. But it was real in a way that the previous life had not entirely been real, in the way that things you've actually chosen, rather than accumulated, tend to be real. He called his sister in Incheon for the first time in 4 years. She answered, with the particular voice of someone who had been waiting for a call and had prepared themselves not to show it. Ji-won, she said. I know, he said. I know it's been too long. Yes, she said. It has. They talked for 1 hour and 20 minutes, which was longer than they had talked in total in the past 3 years. And it was not an easy conversation. There was history in it. Old grievances and long silences and the particular friction of family that has been set aside rather than resolved. But it was real, and it was his, and when he hung up, he sat by the window and watched the river, and felt something loosen slightly in his chest, something that had been there so long he had stopped noticing it. Amara stood at the podium in a conference room at the Seoul Press Club on a Tuesday morning in early December and announced the Celeste Belrose Foundation's inaugural grant program. 32 grants, young entrepreneurs and university students. Fields ranging from sustainable architecture to food systems to financial literacy programs designed specifically for communities underserved by mainstream banking. The last category had been Amara's addition, late in the drafting process. Sujin had raised an eyebrow. Amara had said, simply, people need to understand money before someone uses their not understanding it against them. Sujin had not argued. The press room had 14 journalists and 2 photographers. Sho Mi-rae was in the 3rd row. Amara had known she would be. Mi-rae covered the business and culture space that this event occupied, and she was thorough, and she had been tracking Belrose Meridian Holdings since Yuna had given her the frame 6 weeks ago. They had not spoken since the divorce proceeding. They had no reason to have spoken. But Mirei's presence in the room was its own kind of acknowledgement, the presence of someone who had started pulling a thread and found that what was attached to it was larger than she'd expected. Amara spoke for 22 minutes. She talked about her grandmother, about the specific quality of Celeste Belrose's intelligence, not just financial intelligence, but the intelligence of someone who understood how communities worked, what sustained them, what destroyed them. She talked about the years she had spent watching that intelligence operate. She talked about what it meant to inherit something that was not just money, but a framework, a way of seeing what was needed before the need was visible to everyone else. She did not talk about G1. She did not talk about the marriage or the divorce or the years of building something invisible inside a life that did not see it. She did not talk about any of it because it was not the story she was telling today, and because the story she was telling today was complete without it. When she finished, there were questions. Mirei asked the first one. "Ms. Belrose," she said, with the careful precision of someone who had prepared the question and was delivering it exactly as written. Belrose Meridian Holdings grew significantly over a short period, in circumstances that you've described as, to use your word from the foundation documents, unconventional. Can you speak to what sustained that growth when the external conditions weren't necessarily in your favor? The room was quiet. Amara looked at Mirei. She understood the question beneath the question. She understood that Mirei was not asking about market conditions or investment strategy. She was asking about the marriage, about the years inside the Kang household, about the woman who had built an empire in the hours no one was watching. Amara had decided before this event how she would answer this question if it came in this form. "Clarity," she said. "I understood very early what I was building and why. And I was extremely clear about the difference between what I needed to protect and what I was willing to sacrifice to protect it." She paused. "When you're clear about those two things, a lot of the noise falls away." Mirei made a note, and the foundation, another journalist said, "Why education specifically? Why not direct investment or housing?" "Because everything else builds on it," Amara said. "Housing matters. Investment matters. But if someone doesn't understand how to read a contract, someone else will read it for them, and not necessarily in their interest." She looked at the room. "My grandmother understood that. She didn't give me money. She gave me the knowledge to make money mean something. That's what I'm trying to replicate." The press conference ended at noon. Afterward, in the small reception area outside the conference room, Mirei approached Amara directly. They were the same height. Mirei was 40. With the evaluating eyes of someone whose profession was the gap between what people said and what they meant. "The story I was going to write," Mirei said quietly, without preamble, was about a woman who built a secret empire while her husband wasn't looking. It was a good story. "It is a good story," Amara said. "The story I'm going to write," Mirei said, "is about a woman who built a foundation named after her grandmother and funded 32 young people who might have otherwise not had a shot." She paused. "It's a better story." Amara looked at her. "The first story was going to be about him," Mirei said. "The second one is about you." Amara said nothing for a moment. "Write it accurately," she said. "I always do," Mirei said. She moved toward the door. Amara watched her go. The KFIU investigation against the Baekryu Syndicate's financial structures formally became a prosecutorial referral in late January. Jiwon's name appeared on the referral as a person of interest in connection with 4 specific transactions. Not the full scope of what Jiwon had documented. Cho Young-hee's team had successfully argued the contextualization for several of the ancillary structures, narrowing the exposure to the most specific and most clearly documented transactions. 4 was still significant. Jiwon sat with Cho Young-hee in her office and listened to the assessment of where they stood. "The referral narrows the field," Cho said. 4 transactions specifically authorized in a window between 3 and 5 years ago. The prosecution's argument will be that you had knowledge of the irregular nature of the routing. And our argument, Jiwon said, that the routing structures were designed and implemented by your financial manager, acting within the scope of his authority, that the authorizations you provided were consistent with normal operational approvals you gave Jiwon across hundreds of transactions, and that you had no specific knowledge that these 4 transactions differed from the legitimate operational payments they were categorized as. Is that argument true? Ji-won said. Cho Young-hee looked at him. It was a direct question, the kind that clients did not normally ask attorneys in this situation, and it required a direct answer that attorneys in this situation did not normally give. It is partially true, she said carefully. You did provide routine authorizations without specific review of the underlying structures. You did rely on Ji-won's design and management. Whether you had or should have had knowledge of the irregular nature, that's where the gray area exists. I knew the organization operated in ways that weren't entirely clean, Ji-won said. Yes, she said. I didn't know the specifics of these 4 transactions. That's the distinction we're building on. He looked at the referral document on the table between them. He thought about the gray area she had named. He had been sitting with it for weeks, the specific question of what he had known and what he had chosen not to know, which were different things, and also, in some ways, the same thing. He had run an organization that required a certain deliberate incuriosity about its own mechanics. He had given authorizations without looking at what he was authorizing. He had trusted Ji-won because trusting Ji-won meant not having to understand what Ji-won was doing, and not understanding had been, in its own way, a choice. He had made a lot of choices by not choosing. He understood that now. Negotiate, he said. Cho looked at him. The best resolution available, he said. Don't fight the full case. Find where we can acknowledge what's real and protect what needs to be protected, and negotiate the rest. That's a significant departure from the full defense strategy, she said. I know what it is, he said. Do it. She was quiet for a moment. The financial penalty will be substantial, she said. I know. There may be operational restrictions, a period during which you cannot serve in a leadership capacity for certain types of organizations. I know, and your name will be on a prosecutorial record, regardless of how the negotiation resolves. Cho, he looked at her directly. I spent 14 years building something through methods that I knew, in the part of myself I didn't examine closely, were not entirely legitimate. The investigation found the part I didn't examine. I'm not going to spend 2 years fighting the consequences of that with arguments that are partially true. He picked up the referral document and set it aside. Negotiate. I'll live with what comes from an honest negotiation. Cho Young-hee looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. She made a note. It'll take 3 to 4 months to work through the negotiation process, she said. During that time, maintain the status quo. Don't talk to journalists. Don't make public statements. Don't contact anyone named in the investigation. Understood, and Ji-won, she looked up from her notes. The organization Baekryu. The negotiation will require some degree of cooperation that may affect the organization's interests. He looked at her steadily. The organization, he said, will manage without me. It has been managing without me for 2 months. It will continue to manage. He stood. He walked out of Cho Young-hee's office and into the January street, where the cold was absolute and direct, and the river was somewhere beyond the buildings, invisible but present, the way it always was. Amara heard about the negotiation through Soo-jin in February. Not the details were confidential, and she had not sought them. What Soo-jin told her was that the KFIU prosecution had entered a negotiated resolution process, which meant the full trial scenario was off the table, which meant the exposure for anyone peripherally connected to the financial structures was significantly reduced. Including Amara's peripheral connection, through the years she had managed the routing. Soo-jin had been very still when she told her this. The negotiation removes the risk to you, Amara said. It significantly reduces it, Soo-jin said. A negotiated resolution means the government is accepting a controlled accounting rather than pursuing a comprehensive investigation. The comprehensive investigation would have looked at everyone who touched the financial structures. The controlled accounting looks at specific authorized transactions. Ji-won chose negotiation, Amara said. It appears so. Amara sat with that. She had not asked Ji-won to negotiate. She had not suggested it through any channel. He had done it, apparently, for his own reasons, reasons she could not fully know and was not going to ask about. But the consequence of it was that she was safer. He had made a choice that cost him more and protected her, and he had not announced it, and had not used it as leverage, and had not sent a message through Sujin or anyone else saying, "You're welcome," or "Now we're even," or any of the things a man might say if the choice had been made for an audience. He had just made it. She thought about the night he had come to her office. The way he had stopped at the door and started a sentence he didn't finish. She would have what? Approved, maybe. Understood. Recognized in the foundation the same logic Celeste had always operated by, the logic of building something that outlasted yourself, something that carried your values forward in the world rather than just your name. Amara sat in her office for a long time. The river was its usual self outside the window, indifferent, continuous, carrying the city's reflection without comment. She thought about the woman she had been when she married Jiwon. Younger, more certain of some things, less certain of others. She had loved him, genuine in the way. Someone whose possibilities seemed larger than their reality she had loved. Who he could have been as much as who he was. And when the gap between the two became undeniable, she had stopped both loving both versions and begun the quiet work of building her own future. She did not regret having loved him. She did not regret having left. Both things were true, and the truth of both of them was part of who she was, now not wounds exactly. More like the particular density that experience gave a person when they had lived through something hard and come out the other side, not intact in the original sense, but intact in a new one. Spring came to Seoul the way it always did, tentatively. At first, the cold releasing in increments, then suddenly and completely, the city going from gray to green in what felt like a single week. The Celeste Belrose Foundation's first grant ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in late April in a community center in Mapo that Belrose Meridian Holdings had developed, and that was now a gathering place for the kind of mixed-income, multi-generational neighborhood that Amara had believed in when the spreadsheets had not yet confirmed that it was viable. 32 recipients. They ranged in age from 19 to 34. They came from 7 different cities. Several had traveled for the event. They sat in fold chairs, arranged in careful rows, and they had the particular quality of people who had been told they had been chosen, and were not quite sure yet what that meant for them. Amara walked through them before the ceremony started, not formally, not working a room, just moving and stopping and asking questions and listening to the answers, with the full attention of someone for whom listening was not a performance, but a practice. A young woman named Jisoo, 22, from Daejeon, who was developing a financial literacy curriculum for high school students in low-income districts. A man named Taeyong, 28, from Busan, who was building a sustainable urban farming system for apartment buildings. A woman named Clara, 31, Korean-American, who had grown up in Los Angeles and come to Seoul to start a design firm focused on accessible public spaces. Amara talked to each of them. She asked what the money would make possible that hadn't been possible the day before. She asked what they were afraid of. She asked what their grandmothers would have said about what they were doing. Not because it was a clever question, but because it was the question that mattered to her, the question that connected the present moment to the longer thread of what people built and what survived them. Min-jae stood near the back of the room, watching her move through the 32 recipients, and when she finally came to stand beside him, he handed her a coffee and said nothing for a moment. "You're good at this," he said. "My grandmother was better," she said. "I don't think that's true." She looked at him. He was not performing a compliment. He was stating what he saw, the way he always stated what he saw, without embellishment or strategy. She had come to trust that. It had taken months to come to it, months of being in a situation where someone's attention was fully genuine, and her instinct was still to look for the angle, the agenda, the thing being managed. She had trained herself, through years of living with someone who was always managing something, to look for management in human interactions. She was learning slowly to look for something else. "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes, he said. "I know." "Are you ready?" She thought about the question. She thought about a courthouse in November. A black sedan at the curb, a driver who bowed, the particular silence of a woman who had already finished her grief and was walking toward the next thing. Yes, she said, she was ready. The ceremony ran 90 minutes. Amara spoke twice, once at the opening, once at the close, and the second speech was shorter than the first, which was intentional because by the end of an event like this, the words needed to be fewer, and the weight in them needed to carry more. She stood at the podium and looked at 32 faces. My grandmother told me once that wealth was not about ownership, she said. She said it was about responsibility. She said the question was never how much you had. The question was what you did with it when no one was watching. She paused. I built the thing I built when no one was watching. I'd like to think she would have approved of what happened next. She stepped back from the podium. The room applauded. 6 weeks later, Amara sat across a dinner table from Min-jae in the restaurant where they had shared their first working lunch, the one near the construction site, the one she had chosen because it was convenient rather than because she was trying to impress anyone. They had been back several times since. It had become a habit. The food was the same food. The restaurant was the same restaurant. The city was visible. Through the window, the spring evening light, giving everything outside the particular warmth of a season that had been earned. Min-jae had been quiet through most of the meal, which was not unusual. He was a man who was comfortable with silence in a way that had taken her a long time to stop interpreting as disapproval. Now she understood it as the silence of someone who was present and did not require the noise of conversation to confirm it. He put his fork down. He looked at her across the table. I've been thinking about something for a few months, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. I can tell when you're thinking about something specific, she said. You get a particular quality of stillness. He almost smiled. Particular quality of stillness. It's distinct, she said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He put a small box on the table. Not expensive packaging. The box was simple, plain dark blue, the kind you got from a jeweler who understood that what was inside was the point. He did not open it. He did not pick it up. He put it on the table between them and looked at her. I'm not going to tell you what you need, he said. I know better than that. I'm going to tell you what I want. He met her eyes. I want to build the rest of this with you, not because of the company or the foundation or any of it, because of who you are on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing is happening and you're just thinking about something and you haven't said it yet. The restaurant moved around them, other tables, other voices, the soft percussion of a kitchen doing its work. Amara looked at the box. She looked at Min-jae. She thought about the specific distance between the woman who had sat at a divorce table in November and the woman sitting here now, not across from someone who wanted to own her or manage her or define her by her usefulness to his life, but across from someone who had watched her work and watched her think and watched her carry hard things and had decided, from all that watching, that he wanted to be beside her. That was different. She knew, now, the difference between being beside someone and being consumed by them. She reached across the table and opened the box herself. The ring inside was simple, not understated in the way of something that was trying to look uncomplicated, simple in the way of something that was exactly what it was. She looked at it for a moment. Yes, she said. Min-jae exhaled. Just once, just a quiet breath, the breath of a man who had been holding something and had put it down. She slid the ring on herself, which he understood, without being told, was the right way for this particular woman to receive this particular moment. He picked up his wine glass. She picked up hers. They didn't say anything more for a while. They didn't need to. In Yongsan, Ji-won ate dinner alone at his kitchen table. He had developed over the past months a habit of cooking simple things, nothing elaborate, the food of someone who was learning domestic life from its foundations, rather than inheriting it from staff. He made decent rice. He had improved his jjigae to the point that his sister had stopped commenting on it when she visited. His sister visited more often now. They were building something, not the relationship which had been distant and occasionally fraught, but something new, the relationship of two people who had chosen each other after not choosing each other for a long time. He was learning how to do that. The negotiated resolution had concluded in March. The outcome was what Cho Young-hee had prepared him for, a substantial financial penalty, a 5-year restriction on serving in a leadership capacity for certain categories of organizations, and a permanent entry on the regulatory record. He had settled it and paid it and signed the documents and come home to the Yongsan apartment and cooked rice. The Baekryu syndicate continued under Baek's management. G1 was no longer on the board. The separation had been complete and procedurally clean, which was the best available version of how that kind of ending went. He did not know what came next. That was the truest thing he could say about his life. At this moment, he did not know what came next, and he was, slowly and imperfectly, learning to sit with not knowing. Not to be comfortable with it. He was not a man built for comfort with uncertainty, but to be honest about it, which was different. He washed his dishes. He stood at the window with a glass of water and looked at the river. The river was the same river it always was. He thought about Amara's foundation. He had read Mireille's article, the one about the 32 grant recipients, the one that had run in a Sunday magazine and had been shared widely because it was the kind of story people shared, the kind that made you feel something clear and direct. He had read it twice. He had not contacted Amara. He would not contact Amara. That was not a decision made from bitterness or from fear. It was a decision made from understanding. She had built her life, and her life was complete and forward-facing and full of the kind of purpose that expanded rather than diminished. His presence in it was not something she needed, not something that would add to what she had built. It was not something she had asked for. The only gift he could give her, and it was a small gift, and it was late, and it did not come close to matching what had been taken, was the gift of not requiring anything from her. He was trying to give it. He was not always succeeding. On the worst nights, and there were still worse nights, probably always would be. He stood at this window and thought about the kitchen table in the Mapogu apartment, and himself walking to the refrigerator, and the words she had said, and how completely he had accepted it, that had moved in that same direction, and the cost. He thought about it, and he let it sit there, unresolved, the way certain things needed to sit unresolved, because they had no resolution that would satisfy, because the weight of them was the truth, and the truth did not get lighter. It just became more familiar. He drank his water. He turned from the window. He washed the glass and put it away and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The river ran through Seoul the way it always had, through the years of building and the years of losing, through the marriages and the divorces and the investigations and the grants and the proposals and the dinners and the quiet evenings alone. It ran past the community center in Mapogu, where 32 young people had sat in folding chairs and been told their ideas mattered. It ran past the Yongsan apartment building, where a man was learning to live inside his own consequences. A sound like green wood splitting. It ran past the office building in Hanam-gu, where a woman had built something extraordinary in the years when no one was looking, and was now building something better in the years when everyone could see. The city moved around it. The river did not require the city to explain itself. It just ran, clean and continuous and indifferent to the weight of everything that had happened along its banks, carrying the reflection of the bridge, lights on its surface, the way it carried everything briefly, impermanently, and then letting go. Amara Belrose woke up on a Monday morning in June with the ring on her hand and the foundation work on her desk, and the next phase of the Hongdae development in her schedule, and the particular quality of a life that was fully, completely, without reservation her own. She made coffee. She stood at the window. The river was bright with summer morning light, and the city was beginning its day, and she had work to do, good work, work that mattered. Work that carried her grandmother's name and her own name and the names of 32 people who were building things in 7 cities. Because she had decided, a long time ago, in a life that looked very different from this one, that the money meant responsibility. She drank her coffee. She sat down at her desk. She began.